I've always felt there was something strangely appealing about being an outsider. Sure, it's easier to go with the crowd and feel like you fit in, but there's a special kind of satisfaction in swimming against the current and knowing that what you're doing is entirely down to you. It's this drive to be different that made George Lucas turn away from Hollywood and shoot Star Wars on his own terms, that made David Bowie ditch Ziggy Stardust despite it launching his career, and inspired George R.R. Martin to push on with Game of Thrones after his publisher advised against writing novels. While there's absolutely nothing wrong with building on what has come before you, that sweet spark of innovation only comes when you step away from everyone else and start thinking like an outsider. This is particularly true in the world of video games, where steep financial pressures and risk-averse publishers are constantly pushing studios to stick to what works. A way of thinking that generally produces pretty uninspired games and can make every major AAA release feel pretty damn identical. Considering that the industry was built on the back of developers who did things differently. Hideo Kojima, Warren Spector, Yuji Horii, John Carmack and Shigeru Miyamoto, just to name a handful. It's so frustrating that the future we're heading into looks so deeply terrified of doing its own thing. So with that sobering thought, today I want to look back at two of my favourite free thinkers. A pair of passionate developers who put together a studio that didn't follow any of the conventional rules, and in the process created one of the most captivating video game franchises in history, Dishonored. It's a story of the clash between creative ambition and commercial success, the rich in their towers and the poor down below, a world of tense stealth and bone-crunching action where magic and machines exist alongside one another. But above all else, this is a story about outsiders. Raphael Colantonio and Harvey Smith, Corvo Attano and Emily Caldwin, the beating heart at the centre of Arkane Studios, and the twisted world of Dishonored. To understand Arkane Studios, we need to get to know its co-owners, two men who entered the video game industry through rather unconventional paths, which would have a massive influence on the sort of games that they produced. Everything began back in 1992, with the release of Origin Systems' Ultima Underworld, The Stygian Abyss, a groundbreaking role-playing game by the visionary designer Warren Spector. Ultima had already been an extremely popular PC series, but Underworld pushed it to entirely new heights. Not only thanks to it being the first high-quality first-person RPG, but because it gave players a huge amount of freedom and a large non-linear environment in which to experiment. Spector's team had put a huge amount of effort into making the Stygian Abyss a believable and realistic space, and this meant players were free to tackle challenges in all sorts of different ways and explore the game's sprawling world at their own pace. It proved to be wildly influential, directly contributing to the identity of massive series like Half-Life, The Elder Scrolls and Bioshock, but I want to focus on its impact on two particular people. The first was Raphael Colantonio, a French student who loved Ultima Underworld so much that he entered what he thought was a competition to win a trip to Origin Systems' Austin-based studio. Much to his surprise, he ended up being called by Origin's parent company, Electronic Arts, who informed him that the competition hadn't actually been real and had instead been devised as a way to find potential employees for a new French-based division. Well, to Colantonio, that sounded far better than a trip to Texas, so he began working in QA at the new offices of EA France, and started giving feedback on French-language versions of games like Ultima Underworld 2 and System Shock. It was a job that he absolutely loved, but unfortunately it didn't last very long, as while these sorts of complex PC RPGs were raking in critical acclaim, they weren't generating the kind of profit that EA wanted, which led to a publisher-wide pivot towards console games and high-profile sports licenses. This left Colantonio feeling rather disillusioned, so in 1999 he decided to take a leap into the unknown and set up his own studio in Lyon, a place where he could focus on the kinds of games he loved, Arkane Studios. Now at first things seemed very promising. Colantonio was able to get the blessing of one of Ultima's key designers, Paul Neurath, and had little trouble assembling a team of developers that wanted to produce another Underworld game. The problem was that EA would only sign over the rights if the team at Arkane allowed the publisher to dictate certain elements of its design, which was something that Colantonio would simply never agree to. While this showed an admirable commitment to his ideals, it left Arkane's first project in a bit of an awkward place, as it had to rebrand into a new IP and caused a frantic search for a publisher. Thankfully, a deal was eventually struck with Austrian company Joe Wood Productions. Despite everything working against them, Arkane did manage to release their first game in Germany, the UK, North America and Australia in 2002, under the new title Arx Fatalis. Now, despite starting life as a spiritual successor to Ultima Underworld, Arx Fatalis did have quite a bit of its own identity. The game placed a heavy emphasis on environmental storytelling and atmosphere, taking players across an underground society full of different fantasy races, all competing for survival after a mysterious apocalyptic event up on the surface. Thanks to ambitious details like every single NPC having voice-acted lines that changed based on your actions, huge chunks of optional gameplay that were included just to add flavour to the world, and a very complex magic system that saw players drawing runes on the screen with a mouse, Arx Fatalis ended up reviewing surprisingly well. Critics saw it as a clever middle ground between immersive stealth games like Thief and Deus Ex and the more hardcore RPG trappings of the Ultima series. And amidst a host of RPG awards from outlets like GameSpot and the Academy of Interactive Arts, there was a lot of excitement about the future of this small French studio. It was a great start for Colantonio, but unfortunately the next steps were not so straightforward. While work immediately began on Arx Fatalis 2, Arkane's first release had actually ended up selling quite poorly, which meant they had once again struggled to find a publisher, and by 2004 work needed to cease as they simply couldn't continue without a distribution deal. Thankfully, salvation appeared in the form of a partnership with fellow French developer Ubisoft, who had just acquired the Might and Magic series and were looking for a studio to reboot its image with a more action-focused spin-off. So just like how Arkane's Ultima game had transformed into Arx Fatalis, this agreement turned Arx Fatalis 2 into Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, a 2006 standalone title that paired the series' traditional RPG tropes with a heavy dose of bone-crunching violence. While the result was much more structurally linear than Arx Fatalis, guiding players across the city of Stonehelm on a series of missions to stop a demonic prophecy, the gameplay was far more freeform, and saw Arkane focusing on creating interesting interlocking systems. While there is a touch of exploration and player choice, most of the game is spent in frenetic hand-to-hand combat, where you've got to use your physical skills or magical attacks while taking advantage of a hugely interactive environment. Thanks to the decision to make a powerful kick one of your base moves, you're just as likely to be ragdolling enemies into spiked pits or off of cliffs as you are firing fireballs. And it means that while Dark Messiah might have the look of a generic fantasy RPG, it's more of a satisfying kinetic brawler. It's a surprisingly fresh take on a genre that can often be quite stale, but unfortunately for Arkane, once again, their invention wasn't rewarded with commercial success. While many critics appreciated what they were trying to do, sales simply didn't materialise, and after a disastrous Xbox 360 port, which was universally panned for its terrible performance and simplified systems, Ubisoft decided to shelve the partnership and any hope of a sequel. So despite Arkane having produced two pretty interesting games, they were once again left in the lurch, and this led to a really tough period where Colantonio struggled to convince publishers to believe in them, and saw the studio under constant threat of closure. At first he thought they'd struck gold when Valve contacted him about producing a game called Ravenholm, which would expand on the legendary horror sequence from Half-Life 2. While the team put together a pretty advanced prototype, Valve decided to cancel the project in 2007, and this left Arkane with a big slice of shooter gameplay and nothing to use it on. They decided to try and twist this into a multiplayer game called The Crossing, which was based around a blend of single-player and multiplayer gameplay, both of which would be happening at the same time, and all sounded very ambitious. While the team were pretty excited about it, and The Crossing even featured in a few magazine previews, it ended up being ditched after Arkane were approached by EA and Steven Spielberg, who wanted them to contribute to a project tentatively called LMNO. The idea was for a narrative-driven experience about a man and an alien woman on the run, but again, after producing a big, comprehensive prototype, the project was shut down after the Spielberg-EA partnership collapsed. After almost 4 years without a proper release, things had become so desperate that Colantonio was forced to accept a series of smaller support contracts, first assisting 2K Marin on Bioshock 2 and then Treyarch on Call of Duty World at War, all in service of keeping the lights on. By 2010, the situation was critical, and if the ambitious French studio couldn't land a proper contract, there would be little other option but to close down. Well, considering this video is about Dishonored, it's pretty obvious that things did eventually turn around. But before we talk about how that happened, we need to rewind back to 1994 and talk about our second outsider. This is Harvey Smith, and while Rafael Colantonio was being inspired by Ultima Underworld, Smith was experiencing exactly the same thing on the other side of the globe. Now, despite his love of video games and Dungeons & Dragons, Smith had originally joined the US Air Force as a satellite engineer, and had only ended up in the video game industry thanks to a recommendation from a friend who worked at Origin Systems, the company that developed Ultima Underworld. When his military commission ended, he packed up and moved to Austin, Texas, where he managed to get a job working in QA, which he credits to the amount of time he spent hanging out in the office rather than his CV. So just like Colantonio was doing at EA France, Smith spent his early career engrossed in the design of highly ambitious games like Wing Commander and System Shock, and these would prove to be very influential when he finally made the jump into development. Apparently this happened because Smith had been assigned to provide QA on Ultima 8 Pagan, a game he passionately disliked, and for some reason had produced a 100-point document outlining all of his various complaints. Somehow this had made its way onto the desk of creator Richard Garriott, but rather than chewing him out, Garriott found himself agreeing with a lot of Smith's criticisms, and decided to bring him into the production of the upcoming CD-ROM version. Now, while they weren't able to turn around the fate of Pagan, which is still largely disliked, it had proven that Smith had ideas of his own, and was ready to make the jump from testing to creating. After a short stint working on a strategy game called Technosaur, he decided to leave Origin and take a job at another Austin-based studio called Ironstorm, where he'd be working alongside his idol, the Ultima Underworld creator Warren Spector, as the lead designer on a little game called Deus Ex. Now, it probably seems redundant to say, as Deus Ex has become an important milestone in the history of video games, but it really can't be overstated how fresh it was in the year 2000. When many releases were still using pre-rendered backgrounds and linear arcade structures. With its open-ended levels that rewarded player experimentation, Deus Ex was somehow a first-person shooter and a stealth game and an RPG, all rolled up with a really unique American near-future aesthetic that told a story infused with classic conspiracy theories. It's a legendary game for a reason, but what's really impressive is that it was Harvey Smith's first ever leadership role. And clearly, both Richard Garriott and Warren Spector saw something special in the way he approached design. This meant that it didn't raise any eyebrows when he was announced as the director of Deus Ex's sequel, Invisible War, but unfortunately this would mark the start of a tough few years for our ex-Air Force outsider. While Deus Ex Invisible War ended up selling quite a bit better than the first game, and reviewed very well with contemporary critics, hardcore fans were much more negative, and this eventually cut through, creating a perception that it was nowhere near as good as the original. In a double blow for Smith, Ironstorm was closed down by its parent company Eidos shortly after Invisible War's release, which meant that he had to immediately find a new job, a process that led him to joining Midway to work on a squad-based shooter called Black Site Area 51. This proved to be an unmitigated disaster, as while Smith had lofty ambitions for the sort of game his new team could produce, financial issues caused Midway to push the game out long before it was ready, and amidst dreadful sales numbers and scathing reviews, Smith publicly imploded. In an interview at the Montreal Game Summit in 2007, he heavily criticised the company for how they forced their teams to work, even going as far as to say their processes were f***ed up. When his employer caught wind of this, Smith was promptly fired. Despite having worked on some of the finest games ever made and enjoying the blessing of multiple industry legends, in 2008 Harvey Smith was unemployed and didn't know if he'd ever get a chance to produce another game. Luckily for him and us, fate had other plans. You see, Smith had a long-time friend who lived in France and who he'd spent years exchanging emails with, where they discussed everything from storytelling to game design to how they felt the industry should work. By sheer coincidence, in late 2008, Smith's friend was in Austin, setting up a new studio that he hoped might turn around the fortunes of his own troubled career. And he had a very interesting proposal. This was, of course, Rafael Colantonio, and he wanted Smith to join him at Arkane, not just as a designer or director, but as the co-owner, someone whose vision would form part of the company's very identity and would help him manage the new two-studio structure. It was a crazy offer, but they were so aligned in their thinking that it made perfect sense. They'd both come into the industry thanks to a love of Ultimate Underworld. A background in quality assurance had given them an eye for creative gameplay, and then they'd cut their teeth on immersive games that hadn't quite lived up to their intense ambitions. Surely if the video game mainstream wasn't ready to embrace these two outsiders separately, then maybe by working together, they could forge something special. Well, my friends, this last roll of the dice proved to be just what they needed, as within a few years, both men were on top of the industry, riding a huge wave of commercial and critical success, thanks to a game called Dishonored. So our protagonists had finally come together, but despite all the ambition and talent of the studio, Arkane was still in a tough financial position, and it would take the influence of another free thinker to bring them back from the brink. This was Todd Vaughn, the Vice President of Development at ZeniMax Media, who in early 2010 called Colantonio and Smith to ask if they would produce a game for him. For a small studio that had struggled to find work for almost half a decade, this was a pretty big deal, as ZeniMax had slowly transformed into a major publishing force and had a monstrous reputation thanks to the work of their subsidiary Bethesda Softworks. Thanks to a run of absurdly successful self-published games, Elder Scrolls Morrowind in 2002, Oblivion in 2006, Fallout 3 in 2008, and then Skyrim in 2011, Bethesda had become a money-printing machine, and this had funded a big expansion in the publishing side of the business. By 2010, they'd acquired id Software and helped kickstart the Rage series, purchased Machine Games and set them to work reviving Wolfenstein, and had then funded a new studio called Tango Gameworks, which was led by Resident Evil guru Shinji Mikami. So with epic PC RPGs, first-person shooters and third-person horror games all coming out under the Bethesda banner, Todd Vaughn went looking for more studios that could not only complement this lineup, but bring something fresh to the industry. This is what led to the call with Arkane, as he'd been a big fan of the ideas behind both Arx Fatalis and Dark Messiah. But surprisingly, Bethesda weren't interested in continuing either of these properties. Vaughn's proposal was that Arkane would work on a supernatural ninja game set in feudal Japan, an idea that had been knocking around at the Bethesda offices for a few years, and which he felt would suit the team's propensity to mix action and stealth with immersive level design. Considering the financial issues that had been facing the studio, Colantonio and Smith jumped at the opportunity, but amazingly, when they came back to Vaughn a few months later, the two Mavericks had changed virtually everything about the project except its title, Dishonored. Apparently, after sitting down with art director Sebastian Mittel, they'd realised that they knew almost nothing about feudal Japan, so they'd taken the decision to shift the setting to 17th century London, swapping cherry blossoms and paper walls for the labyrinthine streets of a city ravaged by the plague. Surprisingly, Vaughn absolutely loved this, and was so impressed that not only did Bethesda decide to push ahead with this new version of Dishonored, but they opted to buy out Colantonio and Smith and brought Arkane into the ZeniMax publishing family. Now typically these sorts of moves spell disaster for developer freedom, but Colantonio and Smith didn't see things this way, and were actually overjoyed to pass away the responsibility of owning the studio. You see, both of them hated the business side of running Arkane, and found having to endlessly pitch to publishers and argue with lawyers took them away from what they loved, which was creating interesting video games. By selling Arkane to ZeniMax, this all went away, and as Vaughn totally bought into their vision of immersive and genre-blending development, the sale felt more like the team being set free, rather than constricted by a big bad publisher. So with that resolved, the teams at Arkane Lyon and Arkane Austin threw themselves into this new London-centric version of Dishonored. But as pre-production continued throughout 2011, even this began to morph into something new. The biggest cause of this was a man called Viktor Antonov, who was credited as the game's visual designer and had a huge influence over the look and feel of Dishonored's world. While he had started his career in architectural design, Antonov had found his way into the video game world and had gained a huge reputation for his work on Valve's Half-Life 2, where he'd served as the art director and been responsible for the iconic dystopian look of City 17. Smith and Colantonio had long been trying to work with him, so when he agreed to join Dishonored's production, Antonov was given a huge amount of freedom, and his concept art formed the backbone of not only the game's look, but also its story and gameplay. He would design machines and buildings that would then become in-game items or inspire new levels, and thanks to his obsession with the work of British painter John Atkinson Grimshaw, lots of effort was poured into capturing the uniquely gloomy atmosphere that Antonov was producing in his drawings. Now, as more and more concept art began to flow onto the desk of Arkane's designers, it became clear that the realistic historical setting wasn't allowing the team total creativity, so the decision was made to ditch London and head into the world of fantasy. Dishonored would now be taking place in the city of Dunwall, the capital of the Empire of the Isles, and the aesthetic was brought forward to more of a 19th century Napoleonic look, which allowed Antonov to better embrace his talent for strange steampunk machinery and grandiose romantic architecture. So while the art design and world building were in a constant state of flux, the gameplay objectives remained constant, as Colantonio and Smith were totally committed to the idea of a first-person experience that allowed for lots of immersive player freedom. It was a chance to take all their influences and blend them into a single experience. The tense stealth of the Thief series, the freeform gameplay of Deus Ex, the environmental storytelling of System Shock, and the unique atmosphere of Ultima Underworld, a tribute to everything that had made them want to get into the industry. Now that might paint a picture of a retro throwback, but Dishonored was trying to use these ideas to innovate, and broke away from a lot of popular industry trends. Early on, the team decided they'd opt against the 7th generation obsession with open worlds, and instead stuck to a linear level-based structure, which would allow each location to be packed full of detail that both served the story and gameplay. Smith wanted players to be able to look in a room and know exactly where they could move or what enemies were patrolling, without the game having to make it obvious through garish prompts. And this led to some very clever ideas, like different enemies having differently proportioned models, which meant you could identify targets at just a glance, or giving buildings large vertical interiors, which meant players could scope out the environment without the need for an in-game map. This was in stark contrast to the heavy hand-holding of most early 2010s video games, but not all of Dishonored's design was rooted in high-concept thinking, as lots of its best ideas emerged from its team of testers, who constantly experimented with its systems and found strange bugs that would later become features. For example, during one session, it was discovered that a tester had worked out how to get through a level by going out of bounds. But rather than patching in an invisible wall, the team decided to add proper textures to that part of the map and brought the route into the level proper. Similarly, Harvey Smith realised late on in development that some testers were able to get through almost every level without ever killing anyone, and it inspired him to make some changes to the main story that would mean you could play through the entire game non-lethally. Now, you'd be forgiven for having doubts about all of this coming together, as while Arkane had made a couple of pretty interesting games, they'd never delivered a project on this sort of scale. And to make matters even more complex, Dishonored would also be releasing on the PS3 and Xbox 360. This was something pretty ambitious, as historically titles like Deus Ex, Half-Life, and even Arkane's own Dark Messiah all had to be seriously scaled back in order to function on home consoles. But Bethesda had committed to feature parity between all versions. This combination of working on unfamiliar platforms and having huge ambitions that were constantly shifting could have easily spelt disaster. But this is where Bethesda showed that they really did believe in Colantonio and Smith's philosophy. Not only did they give Arkane a virtually unheard of 3-year dev cycle, but they also gave the studio a massive budget, with the idea that it wouldn't just be a small-scale release, but a major industry moment. This meant they had access to a lot of resources that they would have never been able to secure as an independent studio, and it helped give the game a level of polish that you'd expect from a much higher profile release. For example, the soundtrack was put together by composer Daniel Licht, who had previously worked with Konami on the Silent Hill franchise, and was best known for his work on the mega-hit TV show Dexter. Much like Antonov's concept art, his soundtrack also drew from the 19th century, but rather than delivering sweeping orchestral pieces, Licht produced something almost minimalist that he described in interviews as an evil fog that built up around the player. It's full of dissonant strings, echoey pianos and groaning choral tones, all of which create this brooding and tense atmosphere that is really a key part of Dishonored's identity, despite being much more reserved than your typical video game soundtrack. Another area where Bethesda's clout paid off was in the quality of voice actors that Arkane were able to secure, as you might be surprised to learn that the cast includes Susan Sarandon, Michael Madsen, Carrie Fisher, Lena Headey, John Slattery, and Chloe Grace Moretz. Really, it's an all-star ensemble, but this curiously wasn't something that was pushed in the marketing. In fact, Smith and Colantonio were keen to emphasise that everyone had been brought on board for their acting talent rather than for the weight of their fame, something that was very brave considering Dishonored was a new IP that would require all the advertising help it could get. Now, their confidence in the art may well have come from the fact that Bethesda put a lot of money into promoting Dishonored, and in the run-up to its October 9th, 2012 release date, the publisher embarked on a really clever marketing campaign that helped drum up some serious hype. The first was a cinematic trailer from the masters of animation at Blur Studio, who under direction from Arkane produced a gorgeous 4-minute teaser of what players could expect. It's here we first get a glimpse of Dunwall, a fetid place where plague-ridden bodies pile high on the pavements, where militaristic policemen use brutal force against protesters, and where nobles sneer as their mechanised vehicles ferry them between luxury mansions. It's dripping in atmosphere, but it also gives us a glimpse into Dishonored's gameplay, as much of the trailer takes place in first person and showcases lots of the abilities that you can use in-game. It's a clever directorial decision, and considering the trailer was watched by millions of people on both YouTube and video game websites, I'd say it really contributed to creating interest in this strange new IP. But the campaign didn't stop there. Bethesda also commissioned a series of animated shorts called The Tales of Dunwall, which provided a captivating insight into the world Arkane had crafted. Each of the tales is narrated by Chloe Grace Moretz, and between her young voice and the intricate hand-painted art, all three shorts feel like a sort of morbid fairy tale. We see a down-on-his-luck inventor, Esmond Burrows, discover that oil drained from whales can be used to power machinery, a discovery that revolutionises industry in the Empire. It brings him wealth and fame beyond imagining, but also a terrible guilt, as the industrial age he has beckoned in crushes the poor in the name of progress. A horrible new world that Esmond decides he can no longer take. Clearly Dunwall is not a kind place, and in the next tale we see this in action, as an unnamed orphan is offered the power to take revenge on his abusers by a mysterious being called the Outsider. It is a blessing, but it is also a curse, and while he tears apart his tormentors with a pack of feral rats, one turns on him and he dies alone in an alley with blood pouring from his eyes. This is a world where power has great consequence, and to use it without care for who it touches is to risk being caught in its terrible wake. The final tale follows Piero Joplin, a talented mechanic who longs to do something more meaningful with his life. At night, he dreams of a vast infinite known as the Void, where he sees the face of death itself and becomes inspired to craft a mask in its likeness. This is the very same image we see on the front cover of Dishonored, a tantalising hint at the role we will play in this strange world. Considering that the three tales add up to a mere 6 minutes of narrative, they do a great job of introducing players to the tone and mythology of the Dishonored world, and really show off that it was going to be about a lot more than just flashy abilities and steampunk visuals. Now, despite all this, in an interview for French magazine Jeux Video, Harvey Smith spoke about how he felt the most important part of Dishonored's pre-release was a video package that simply showed people how to play the game, illustrating that both stealth and all-out action were totally valid. He was terrified that people wouldn't understand the game, and it would slip between action, RPG and stealth fans, rather than appealing to them all. Well, he had little to worry about, as thanks to the sheer strength of its design and the confident way which Bethesda presented it, Dishonored quickly captured the attention of video game journalists and players on both console and PC. When it was finally shown off in a playable state at E3 2012, it lapped up a veritable swarm of show awards and started receiving heavy coverage from popular websites like IGN, GameSpot and Destructoid, all of which only fueled interest in this captivating new game from what felt like an all-new studio. While Arkane's roots stretched back to the industry's early years, it took Bethesda believing in them for this talent to properly flower. And in Dishonored, we finally got the game that Raphael Colantonio and Harvey Smith had been trying to make for decades. So when the gates of Dunwall finally opened on October 9th, 2012, there were few who could turn away from the story of Corvo Attano, the man who killed an Empress. Dishonored opens with the voice of Jessamine Caldwin, Empress of the Isles and master of its capital city, Dunwall, speaking in a letter to the man we play as, Corvo Attano, the Royal Protector. Corvo has been away from court on a mission to seek aid from other nations, as an incurable plague has been tearing apart the Empire, leaving its economy in shambles and taking the lives of thousands of its citizens. Despite the stress she is under, the Empress ends her letter with tenderness. Her heart is at peace when Corvo is near. She tells him that her daughter Emily cannot wait for him to return. Within days of writing this, Jessamine Caldwin will be murdered. We assume our role as Corvo as he returns from this journey, approaching Dunwall Tower in a small raft, and it's during this little prologue sequence that Arkane gently sets out how they want you to interact with this world. You see, Dishonored takes place entirely in first person, and we experience its world and narrative exclusively through Corvo's eyes, without ever relinquishing control for expository cutscenes or lengthy sequences of dialogue. What this means is that most of the wider storytelling is done through the environment, and while you're perfectly welcome to charge through Dunwall, heading from objective to objective, this opening sequence clearly indicates that you should slow down and consider your surroundings. For example, on the boat journey into Dunwall Tower, you can look out across the bay and see factories pouring pollution onto the rest of the city, and a large whaling ship dragging its monstrous catch into port. While the nation is in crisis thanks to the plague, this is hardly a pleasant place to live at the best of times. In fact, one of the first things we see when we step off the boat is the philosopher-scientist Anton Sokolov, the genius behind much of Dunwall's technology, painting a portrait of High Overseer Campbell, the leader of the Empire's military church. Rather than working hard to save the people of the Empire, they are lounging in the tower courtyard, pursuing vainglorious endeavours while the citizens suffer far below. Similarly, when we meet Emily Caldwin, the daughter of the Empress, and play a few rounds of hide and seek with her, this isn't just the game teaching you the stealth mechanics, but a clever way of illustrating the relationship between the heir and royal protector. She feels safe with him, she's trusted to be alone with him, and he indulges her less than royal behaviour. The reason this is interesting is that by opting against using introductory cutscenes, and instead asking the player to engage with the world, Arkane is setting up a cycle that is central to the rest of the game. If you want to learn more about your surroundings or your target, you need to look around, you need to listen, and you need to explore, and by doing this, the world of Dishonored will slowly reveal itself. So eventually Corvo ends up before the Empress, who he finds castigating the royal spy master, Hiram Burrows, for not doing more to help the sick and treating those in need like common criminals. After sending him away, she laments the news that there is no help coming, and reassures Emily that they will somehow find a way to make everything right. Only then does she realise that the guards are missing, and across the courtyard there are strange men leaping across the rooftops. This throws us into our first taste of combat, as Corvo attempts to fight off these peculiar assassins, clothed in the garb of whalers, and using strange powers to hold him in place and appear out of thin air. Unable to do anything, he watches in horror as their leader runs the Empress through and abducts Emily, leaving the royal protector helpless as Jessamine dies in his arms, begging him to save her daughter. At this point, Hiram Burrows returns with the tower guard, and after seeing Corvo caked in royal blood, he orders his arrest, accusing him of the highest of treasons and triggering the title screen as our main character is taken away. We find him 6 months later, strapped to an interrogation chair in the depths of Coleridge Prison, being tortured by High Overseer Campbell, who is demanding that he sign a confession that the Empress died by his hands. Evidently, Corvo has stumbled into a conspiracy to depose Dunwall's leader, and now it's Hiram Burrows who sits upon the throne, ruling as the Lord Regent, while the true heir Emily is hidden away in the city. As Corvo is due to be executed tomorrow, the two men gloat that the truth will never be known, and with that we are taken back to our cell, which is where Dishonored begins in earnest, as a guard appears with food from a sympathetic friend, and hidden inside is the key to Corvo's cell. This begins an escape sequence which doubles as another short tutorial, introducing the various different ways we can approach traversal, and giving players a space to work out if they want to go loud or sneak through the shadows. We'll talk about this dynamic more in just a moment, but for now we'll pick up with Corvo after he's escaped Coldridge, leaping from the gates to a reservoir far below and then slinking away through the sewers. On the other side he meets Samuel Beechworth, a boatman who's been sent to collect the Royal Protector, and who ferries us to the central location of the game, the Hound Pit's pub, a sanctuary from where Corvo's quest for revenge will begin. You see, there are those amongst Dunwall's elite who wish to put a Caldwin back on the throne, a group of loyalists led by Admiral Farley Havelock. It is this group that sprung Corvo from prison in the hope that he would lend his unique skills to their cause. The Admiral is joined by a wealthy nobleman called Trevor Pendleton, who retains a small staff that run the pub, and Piero Joplin, of Tales of Dunwall fame, who resides in a small workshop and offers to supply Corvo with equipment and gear, along with the mask that he crafted in his dreams. Once we've found our feet, Havelock outlines the mission, to locate and eliminate the Lord Regent and his supporters, and while doing so, rescue the rightful heir to the Empire, young Emily Caldwin. This is the central drive behind everything we do as Corvo Attano, and the overarching objective in each of the game's 9 levels. But there is one last figure we need to discuss before the bloodshed begins. When Corvo heads up to his room in the attic of the pub and finally rests his head, he awakens to find himself in a strange and ethereal place. The same void which had visited the young orphan in the streets and had shown Piero the face of death. Here we meet the Outsider, a curious being of power somewhere between a god and a court jester, an entity whose attention has been piqued by the events at Dunwall Tower, and who now steps forward to make matters even more interesting. As his symbol appears on Corvo's left hand, it brings with it access to the Void, a magical energy that bestows powers upon the user and takes on the role of Dishonored's upgrade and progression system. Through becoming more attuned with the Outsider by discovering his runes and shrines, we can grow this connection and develop our abilities. But for now, Corvo is left to blink between striking visions of the Caldwins in danger and a city crumbling under the Lord Regent's rule. When we finally exit the Void, all that's left is for Sam the boatman to take us to our first target, the High Overseer Thaddeus Campbell, and it is here that Dishonored truly begins. Now, the reason I wanted to go through this opening sequence in such detail is because this is really the only thing that different playthroughs of Dishonored have in common. We all see Corvo arrive at the tower, we all see him framed for the Empress's murder, and we all see him strike a pact with both the Loyalists and the Outsider in order to make things right. It's a shared foundation in every player's experience, but beyond this, how Corvo actually goes about confronting the Lord Regent, well, that is entirely down to you and the methods you choose. In its most basic essence, this player choice comes in the form of loud or quiet. Do you want to assault the Overseer's compound head on, or sneak across the rooftops and take him out without anyone knowing you were there? Both options are perfectly valid and have lots of gameplay mechanics designed to flesh them out. If you crouch down, Corvo will switch his blade into a reverse grip, and this indicates that you're hidden, and you can sneak up on guards and perform a takedown, either instantly stabbing them or choking them unconscious, which takes a little more time. Along with this, you can silently take out foes from range with Corvo's crossbow, another gift from Piero. But the downside of this is that not only do you have limited ammo, which means you need to scavenge or purchase replacement bolts, but that leaving dead bodies out in the open will usually result in the alarm being raised. This causes the remaining guards to step off their patrols and call for reinforcements, which means you typically need to take things slowly and consider hiding the bodies of those you do decide to kill. Now, if that all sounds like too much effort, Dishonored is perfectly happy for you to charge into action, with Corvo's background as the Royal Protector explaining how he's able to hold his own against such overwhelming odds. When doing this, our crossbow becomes a pistol, and you have to time blocks in order to deflect damage and open up opponents for lethal counterattacks. Considering how simple the mechanics are, it's all very satisfying, with brutal animations and explosive sounds that make you feel like a master swordsman carving your way through the streets of the city. But it's in the Outsider's powers where these two systems really come alive. You see, along with access to the Void, the Outsider gives us a mechanical heart, a curious item that serves a dual purpose, guiding us to runes and charms that can upgrade our powers while also offering a deeper insight into the world. If you click on a location or person while holding the heart, you'll hear an eerily familiar voice describe something secret about them, and through this you can learn things about Dunwall that would otherwise remain hidden. We can discover that Piero suffers with brain fevers that will eventually take his life, and that he longs for Pendleton's maid Callista and secretly watches her bathe. We can learn that Havelock had unsuccessfully attempted to take control of the Empire's navy after the death of the Empress, and that under Lord Pendleton's noble visage, he is deeply jealous of the influence of his older brothers. It's an extremely engaging way to handle character backstories, not shoving them down our throats in lengthy scripted cutscenes or sprawling dialogue trees, but placing them exactly where they should be, hidden away deep in those characters' hearts. Now, that being said, the main purpose of the heart is to track down upgrades, which appear on screen when you're holding it, need to be located in order to unlock new powers and improve the ones you have. This is the game's central progression system, and it encourages you to explore your surroundings, as the powers are key to everything Arkane are trying to achieve, and frankly, they are extremely fun to use. By the time Sam drops us off at Clavering Boulevard, the main street that leads to the Overseer compound, you should have been able to find around 3 or 4 runes, which means that on top of Blink, which comes for free, you should have at least 1 or 2 additional powers. Now what's cool about this is they aren't your typical video game upgrades. Rather than providing the same old fireballs and heals you see in every other RPG, Dishonored instead gives you tools that don't always have straightforward and obvious uses. For example, Bend Time is an extremely powerful ability that slows down everything around you and freezes it completely when upgraded. But how you use this is completely up to you. If you're opting for stealth, you can use this to slip past checkpoints without being noticed, but it's also extremely strong in the middle of a fight, where you can use it to fire multiple headshots and take out entire squadrons at once. The same is true of Devouring Swarm, a skill that lets Corvo summon a pack of deadly plague rats. You can use it to distract, driving enemies away from items that you want to grab, or use it during a fight to disable a particularly strong foe. And there's even a charm that lets you eat the rats in order to recover health and mana. Even the less flashy abilities can have a serious impact on the moment-to-moment gameplay, like Agility, which doubles the height of Corvo's jump and allows him to run substantially faster. While this might not seem as interesting as teleporting through the air or turning dead foes to ash so you don't have to hide them, it opens up large parts of the levels which would previously be inaccessible, like towering rooftops that provide better angles of attack or open windows that hide additional resources. By placing the focus on function rather than straight improvements, it gives Dishonored's gameplay more of a sandbox feel, where small situations can have lots of different solutions. And this adds not only a huge amount of replayability, but a real sense of reward as you can take your own unique path towards Corvo's revenge. Now, alongside the runes which power your connection to the Void, we can also stumble upon bone charms, little curios made out of mystical whalebone that are carried by disciples of the Outsider. Rather than adding new powers, they provide small modifiers. Things like red potions restoring 25% more health, animations happening slightly faster, or enemies doing slightly less damage. They're not nearly as exciting as the runes and Outsider powers, but there are a handful that can impact certain moments of gameplay, like one that makes plague rats less likely to attack you, or another that makes drinking water from fountains restore a small amount of mana. Like they are in the world, bone charms are a small blessing rather than a large one, but still something you feel compelled to collect as you move through the world. Now, on the subject of scouring the environment, we also need to discuss Dishonored's other, more traditional progression system, the process of acquiring and spending money. Back at the pub, you can have Piero sell the valuable things you find out on your missions, and this can then be used to fund the purchase of various consumables and improvements to your equipment. Much like the bone charms, they aren't as dramatically impactful as the powers, but over the course of the game, they do start to add up. and unlocking things like double the range on your crossbow, or explosive pistol ammo, or silent walking can feel pretty game changing. The only drawback is that in order to unlock most of this gear, you need to not only find the appropriate blueprints, but also a hell of a lot of cash. This means that while you could just head straight towards your target, blinking across rooftops as the crow flies, all these progression systems clearly want you to slow down and take your time, making sure that your missions are just as profitable as they are vengeful. You might not need to head into a wealthy painter's mansion or take a side route through an abandoned apartment complex, but this is where the money lies, and coming across one of Sokolov's aristocratic portraits or a safe full of gold bullion can be just as rewarding as discovering a shrine to the outsider. Now, the final system I want to talk about is how you manage your health and mana, because this really shows how committed Arkane were to pairing every element of design with a believable piece of world building. We restore health and mana through the use of 2 elixirs, one red and one blue. We can carry 10 of each at a time, choosing to use them whenever we want. It's as generic of a recovery system as you've ever seen in a game, but it's cleverly wrapped up in a little nugget of lore that makes it far more interesting. You see, each elixir was made by a rival scientist in an attempt to stem the outbreak of the plague, with the red coming from Sokolov and the blue from Joplin. The idea is that consuming these elixirs helps bolster both the immunity of your body and of your mind, which explains why the rich and powerful of Dunwall are managing to stave off illness, while the poor languish and die. It's a tiny piece of lore that leads to all manner of clever ideas, like the elixirs being quite common in affluent districts and extremely hard to come by in the slums, or a street gang that makes a bootleg version which you can get cheap refills of if you manage to get into their good books. Essentially, every one of Dishonored's systems, from its eye-catching and gameplay warping powers to something as simple as how you regain health, have all been carefully crafted to maximise your immersion and help trick your brain into believing that maybe you are Corvo Attano, and maybe you are prowling the streets of Dunwall. So regardless of how you choose to do it, eventually you'll make your way to Holger Square, where the Overseer's headquarters are located, and where we find a uniformed man locked in a stockade, being demeaned by a fellow Overseer. This is Teague Martin, the man who arranged Corvo's escape from Coldridge Prison, and if we release him, he'll head back to the pub, where he'll play a large role in the coming Loyalist conspiracy. Once that's done, your attention shifts to eliminating High Overseer Campbell, and it's here that we get our first proper taste of that open-ended and reactive level design, which Smith and Colantonio were so obsessed with. There is an incredible variety of ways you can enter the Overseer compound, each of which feels well suited to the specific powers that you might have unlocked. The most obvious is to simply waltz in the front door, but this is pretty challenging considering the courtyard is being patrolled by lots of Overseer guards. It's perfectly possible to fight your way through them, but this will alert Campbell, who will go into hiding, whereas he's much easier to locate if you opt for one of the more quiet approaches. Let's say you jump up on the Overseer gatehouse and then use Blink to get onto the outside of the building. Here there's a ledge wide enough to walk on, and this can take you along the length of the second floor and straight into an open window. Alternatively, you could choose to take a less precarious route through the sewers, which puts Corvo into the kennels, or enter through the backyards, where you can loot an Overseer armory for more resources if you're feeling underpowered. It's extremely impressive for the first proper level in the game, but that isn't even half of it, as once you're inside, the objective becomes finding and dealing with Campbell, a challenge with just as many solutions. Now here I do need to raise my first criticism, as by default, Dishonored has objective markers turned on, and these put an indicator onto your screen which shows you the general direction and distance to your target. I cannot emphasise enough how negatively this impacts the experience, because while Dishonored doesn't have any sort of map system, it's been carefully designed so that you don't need one, and tracking down your target by engaging with the world is far more rewarding. By doing this, you create a really natural process of looking for clues. You might overhear NPCs talking about an appointment your target has, or a specific place that they like to go. By hunting down in-game maps, you can cross-reference this with your surroundings and come to your own conclusions. By allowing yourself to become immersed in the world, the hunt becomes so much more satisfying. And you'd be amazed at how quickly you learn the layouts of these levels when your eyes are trained on the environment rather than an objective marker. So eventually you'll work out that High Overseer Campbell is entertaining a guest in the meeting room. Captain Jeff Curnow, a city watchman who he is planning to poison. Once you arrive in the meeting room, you have a few seconds before Campbell and Curnow enter, and while you can hide up on a bookcase or behind a divider and simply shoot Campbell as he comes in, you'll likely want to take a more subtle approach. You see, in Dishonored, you also need to make your way back to Sam and the boat after you've eliminated your target, and this means blowing your cover to land a killing blow usually isn't a great idea. Instead, you've got to try and plan the perfect hit, a way of getting in and getting out without anyone knowing. So back in the meeting room, you're offered a choice. When you click on the glasses on the table, you can either swap the poison from Curnow to Campbell, or split it between the two of them. Now this might seem a straightforward solution, but there is a spanner in the works, as before you head out on this mission, Curnow's niece, Callista, who works at the pub, asks if Corvo can find a way to spare her uncle's life, as he's apparently a good man trying to do his best for the people of Dunwall. Taking Campbell out without putting Curnow in danger is much more challenging and requires a fair bit of experimentation in order to pull off. One method is to use the upgraded possession skill on Campbell, which disrupts the meeting and causes Curnow to leave, but this is a pretty expensive ability and you'd have needed to invest every possible rune into getting it, something that most players likely won't have done. So you need to get a little more creative. One of the options when you click on the glasses is to spill both drinks, poisoning neither man. This causes Campbell to have to improvise, and so he leads Curnow downstairs to a secret den, where he attempts to stab him in the back and where we can intervene. Now you might think this is where the level ends, but incredibly there is an entirely different way to deal with Campbell, and that's by taking a non-lethal approach. Much like how you can choke out or use sleep darts on the various guards you encounter, you can also spare the lives of your assassination targets, but typically this requires a bit of extra work, and while they stay alive, I'd imagine most wish they hadn't. In Campbell's case, you can overhear two guards talking about something called the Brand of the Heretic, a mark that overseers burn onto outcast members who have cavorted with the outsider. It removes their rank, their possessions, and effectively sends them into poverty at the bottom of the social pyramid. Inside the compound, if we come across the archive while looking for Campbell, Corvo will learn that there is a brand in this very building, locked away in the interrogation room. And with a bit of careful pickpocketing, we can grab hold of it. If instead of killing Campbell, either with the poison or when he attempts to murder Curnow, we knock him out, and then carry him up to the interrogation room, we can take him out of the picture with the heretic's brand, casting him down from his lofty position and dealing a heavy blow to the office of the overseer. The fact that the first proper level of Dishonored contains this degree of interaction is frankly astounding, especially when you consider that we haven't even discussed all the little smaller moments you can come across. A shopkeeper you can rescue from bandits, a side quest that rewards you with extra runes for defending an old woman, and an entirely optional area populated with a gang that are selling bootleg elixir. This sort of level design, where the developers have opted for detailed depth over masses of repetitive content, really didn't exist back in 2012, especially on home consoles, where games tended to be either highly scripted cinematic affairs or super wide open world games. By comparison, Dishonored feels like something completely different, an all-killer, no-filler mixture of atmosphere and drama that somehow manages to deliver a near constant conveyor belt of meaningful player choice. It's clear from just a few hours playing this game that Smith and Colantonio had achieved something very special. But what's even more impressive is that it only gets better from here. In many ways, the mission to eliminate the High Overseer provides the general outline that the rest of Dishonored follows. From our base at the Hound Pits pub, we rest up and restock, and then Admiral Havelock and the Loyalists assign us a target, with each one focusing on a different area of the Lord Regent's power. Over the next 3 missions, we take out Lord Pendleton's twin brothers, a duo that wield disproportionate influence in Dunwall's parliament, abduct Anton Sokolov, the brains behind the Empire's technological might that we saw painting at the tower, and finally kill Lady Boyle, a wealthy aristocrat who is financing the Lord Regent's hold on the city's military. Along with Campbell being removed as the trusty head of the state church, it's a series of surgical strikes designed to destabilise the new regime. But the path we take to achieve this is surprisingly varied. Considering quite how engaging the first proper mission is, you could forgive Arkane for simply repeating this formula and separating the game out into a sequence of assassination sandboxes. Impressively, they have actually done the opposite, and while each mission retains the scope for player creativity, they each use a slightly different structure that keeps things from ever feeling repetitive. Our next journey into Dunwall has us heading to the Golden Cat, a high-class brothel where the rich have their every whims satisfied by poor serving girls plucked from the slums. Here we are not only hunting for the Pendleton brothers, a setup which naturally complicates things as we're trying to take out 2 targets, but we also need to locate Emily Caldwin, who is supposedly being held somewhere within the cat. This gives us quite a spread of different objectives, and is made all the more complex as the Pendletons' locations are randomised between 4 potential suites: the gold, ivory, steam and smoking rooms, which are themselves spread across 3 floors. Thanks to the presence of a lot more guards, the Golden Cat presents a much greater challenge than our trip to Holger Square, but as always, by taking your time, listening to NPCs and observing the environment, Arkane provides plenty of tools to help get the job done. Depending on how you enter the Golden Cat, you'll be met with different pieces of the puzzle. A map at the front desk which outlines the locations of the different suites, a conversation on the 2nd floor between a pair of dancers who discuss Emily's imprisonment, or an argument in the lobby between the Golden Cat's owner and a Pendleton guard, which gives you a hint at where they can be found. Importantly, it's never the whole picture, but rather a starting point, so you still need to make your way around the building and use your powers to either avoid detection or dispatch unfortunate guards who catch you at work. Now, what makes this process so enjoyable is the lavish structure of the building itself, and how seemingly aesthetic decisions have real gameplay consequences. Pretty quickly you'll discover the Central Hall, which is a highly detailed 3-storey space filled with a mixture of drunken guards, innocent dancing girls, and a host of rooms that could contain our targets. At first it might look like everything has been designed to emphasise the yawning gap between the rich and poor of Dunwall, but much of this geometry serves a functional purpose. You can blink to lavish light fittings in order to climb quickly between the floors, or use balconies that overlook the Wrenhaven River to move along the outside of the building. Even the presence of non-combat citizens adds an interesting dynamic, as they'll report you to the guards if they see you, but murdering them simply because they were afraid feels deeply uncomfortable when you're supposedly liberating the city. Now eventually you'll take out Morgan and Custis Pendleton and find Emily locked away on the top floor, apparently because the precocious young heir had been constantly trying to escape. As we step inside, she races over to Corvo and is clearly overjoyed to see him, not only because it means her freedom, but because she genuinely cares for him, which is something that will play a big part in how the rest of the game pans out. Now, while all this marks a clear progression from Holger Square, a substantially larger map to explore, 3 times as many objectives, many more guards to avoid, and a healthy dose of runes and bone charms, what makes it really clever is that there is an entirely different side to the mission. You see, we still need to pass through Clavering Boulevard in order to gain access to the Golden Cat, but after the removal of High Overseer Campbell, the City Watch have erected a watchtower, and this forces you to go around to the east, taking a detour through Bottle Street. Here you can bump into a set of thugs that inform Corvo that their boss, Slackjaw, is looking to speak with him, and if we take up their offer, the issue of Dunwall's political rebels resolves in a totally different way. Initially, Slackjaw wants us to find his second in command, Crowley, who's gone missing while investigating a series of attacks on the gang. His only lead is that a local doctor by the name of Galvani has been speaking out against their bootleg operation, and so his large mansion on Clavering Boulevard seems like a good place to start looking. Unfortunately, the hunt doesn't turn up much, as Galvani is nowhere to be found, and someone else appears to have killed Crowley. But Slackjaw is impressed all the same, and knowing that Corvo is after the Pendletons, he offers a second job. If we can get hold of the code to a safe in a local art dealer's apartment, he'll have his men abduct the brothers, and then shave their heads, cut out their tongues, and sell them into slavery in their own silver mines. A particularly brutal, but decidedly non-lethal solution to the Loyalists' parliamentary problem. Now cleverly, this alternative route still takes us to the Golden Cat, but now we're looking for Bunting the art dealer rather than the Pendletons. By following the same strategy of eavesdropping and scouring the environment, we can work out that he's strapped into a machine in the Silver Room, where he gets his kicks from being electrocuted by the cat's girls. Obviously this gives us a pretty convenient way to extract the information we need, and after saving Emily, we can then head back to Slackjaw and trade the code for the lives of our targets. Interestingly, there isn't anything to stop you from double-crossing Slackjaw, and you're more than able to go and pilfer the safe yourself, and then lie to the gang leader that the loot is still there. It's a small touch that doesn't impact the flow of the level at all, but it's another testament to the sheer openness of Dishonored's design. So with the Pendleton brothers out of the picture, we return to the pub to get our next assignment, but here is where Dishonored throws another curveball, as instead of an even larger map with even more targets, we're given a mission with a very different kind of objective. The next man on Havelock's list is Anton Sokolov, the painter and inventor extraordinaire, but rather than wanting him eliminated, the loyalists want to abduct him and force the savant onto their side. This means that rather than having to choose between a lethal or non-lethal outcome, we instead have to work out how to extract an unconscious body, as you can't use your weapons while carrying Sokolov. On top of this, there's also quite a change to the structure of the mission, as rather than working our way around a single complex space, we have to move through a series of smaller linear areas, heading across the Dunwall Bridge, moving through a military checkpoint, deactivating a substation, and then finally infiltrating Sokolov's safe house. Now while there are a fair amount of interesting things to see along the way, like a thug you can free from prison who later betrays you, or a wealthy noble whose house contains a little picture puzzle, this is probably a good time to talk about the blink ability in a bit more detail. It is an extremely well-designed piece of gameplay, with a satisfying animation and a clever way of indicating what you can and can't reach by changing the way your cursor looks when aiming the skill. Thanks to its relatively low mana cost, you really don't have to hold back on its use, and it feels like the levels have been designed around Corvo quickly teleporting down from the rafters and then blinking away to safety. In areas like the Overseer's compound and the Golden Cat, this works wonderfully, as you can build an understanding of the layout from a high vantage point and then use blink to work your way around. But I do think it's less of a natural fit in an environment where you're simply trying to get from A to B. The journey to Anton Sokolov's safe house seems to derive almost all of its tension and challenge from having no idea where you're meant to be going, something which will only be relevant if you're playing with objective markers turned off. If you're familiar with the layout or are relying on the game to point you in the right direction, reaching a target is actually pretty straightforward, and you can blast through this entire level in just a handful of minutes. In fact, once you reach Sokolov, if you have the upgraded blink, which adds more range to the ability, you can get all the way from his rooftop conservatory back down to Sam the boatman in just 3 blinks. Now I won't lie, it is pretty fun to work this out, and it makes you feel like a true supernatural assassin. But it involves you ignoring almost all of the actual level design and spending most of your time wandering rooftops instead of playing around with your powers. Thankfully, there is only one other level in Dishonored that uses this sort of structure, and it delivers it with quite an interesting twist. So this isn't really a criticism of the game per se, but more a reminder to not always fall back on the same effective strategies, as it can make the game much more rewarding to not always be as powerful as possible. So with Sokolov back in captivity at the pub, we move on to our next target, Lady Boyle, a rich socialite who is funding the Lord Regent's power grab and whose assassination forms Dishonored's most infamous level. You see, this marks the moment where Arkane really gets experimental, as the next area throws out all of the established rules and asks us to go about our business in a totally new way. The idea is surprisingly straightforward. Lady Boyle is holding a masked ball, and thanks to his predilection for hiding his face, Corvo is able to slip in undetected and mingle with Dunwall's high society, masquerading as one of their own and hiding in plain sight. This transforms the gameplay from tense sneaking and surgical strikes into something more akin to a social puzzle game, where you have to speak with the guests and decipher clues in order to work out which of the 3 Boyle daughters should meet the end of our blade. You see, we don't actually know which of the 3 Boyle sisters is our target, and as they're all wearing identical coloured outfits, you don't want to blow your cover taking out the wrong girl. This makes for a very engaging change of pace, and the level has won a lot of plaudits, with it often being referred to as the best part of the game, and a particular high point in Arkane's lengthy history of clever level design. Well, this marks the moment where I get to be a little contrarian, as while Lady Boyle's Last Party does a great many things right, and offers a fantastic break from the typical Dishonored formula, it is also quite dramatically overrated, and has quite a few issues which aren't often spoken about. That being said, let's start off with the good, as this isn't a level that's just been thrown together without real thought. And I don't want my criticism to make it sound like this isn't a profoundly enjoyable part of the game. For starters, the way everything is structured is a real masterclass in pacing. Sam the boatman drops us off in a nearby canal, and we then have to work out how to get into the party before all the social deduction can begin. You can of course climb up as high as you can and just blink over the walls, with the streetlights and manor gatehouse and a nearby apartment block all offering enough height to leap straight into the Boyle Gardens. If that's not your style, you can always possess a fish and swim in through the sewers, or enter via the guards' quarters, which requires a little jaunt through a dangerous infected section of the district, and both place you straight into the heart of the party. Now these are all quite typical Dishonored options, but in an indication of what's to come, you're also able to walk up to the front door and make your way inside as if you were a guest. You see, in the lane outside the manor's entrance, we can watch as a noblewoman loses her invitation, and if you're quick enough to notice it before she does, you can pick up the letter and present it to the guards, waltzing in the front door as the guests chuckle at your fiendishly irreverent mask. Funnily enough, that's not even the only way to get an invitation, as if you chose to loot the art dealer's safe during your work for Slackjaw, you can get hold of Bunting's copy and hand this over, which means you later see the noblewoman and her retinue inside enjoying the party. Before we come on to exactly how you identify and eliminate the correct Boyle sister, we also need to take a moment to appreciate how incredible this level looks, as the mansion interior and the surrounding district is probably the high point of Dishonored's already excellent art design. As we arrive via the canal, we're greeted by a haunting image of a clock tower silhouetted against a full moon. A classic picture of gothic horror that's immediately shattered by the Lord Regent's men blasting away a group of infected citizens. It's the first time we see in person how the new regime is dealing with the pandemic, and it serves as a stark reminder of just why we are working with the Loyalists, as there is far more than just revenge at stake. On top of this, it's also our introduction to the City Watch's Tall Boys, a terrifying elite unit of the City Guard that loom above the populace on stilts and are virtually unkillable in a direct confrontation. This adds a whole new element of danger to Dishonored's stealth gameplay, as they really have to be avoided at all costs. But I've just got to take a moment to point out how great their design is. Considering Viktor Antonov also designed the Striders that patrol Half-Life 2's City 17, he's obviously got a real talent for creating monsters on stilts. Now, along with the repressive military atmosphere, the Estate District also does a fantastic job of showing us the gulf between Dunwall's rich and poor, by having us explore a filthy canal and a dingy plague-ruined tenement, all while fireworks are going off in the distance. It really drives home how little the nobles care for those less fortunate, and this is all the more stark once you step into the party. Artificial light and gentle music bathes every room, while the slums are cloaked in shadow and silence. The manor's architecture is ornate and colourful, while the surrounding district is a brutalist box of simple one-room apartments. In the banqueting hall, a table lies piled high with food, despite people starving to death mere meters from the Boyle's high wall. Nobles bicker about which social event had better drinks, while the kingdom literally crumbles around them. This is all achieved without a second of expository dialogue, and is really a masterful example of how to use the environment and clever art direction to draw the player not only into your world, but to your story. I think this is largely why people love the Boyle's party so much, as it's really an engrossing space to explore, and serves as a much needed mid-game break from the cycle of blinking and knifing and gunfights. In this respect, it's the perfect tonic to the previous few levels, but this is where we arrive at my criticisms, because I think from a gameplay perspective, it's not nearly as interesting as it sounds. The problem is that the entire level presents itself as a puzzle, the mystery of the three coloured Boyle daughters, but it doesn't trust you enough to find the answers on your own. After spending a few minutes wandering around the halls, you'll notice that many of the guests are also interested in their host's hidden identities, and you'll often hear comments that they are sure there must be a clue upstairs. Considering the only other immediate option is to go mad and kill everyone in sight, we can write this off as a somewhat blunt piece of natural direction. And to be fair, getting upstairs is quite a compelling conundrum. You can possess a rat and sneak up there using the vents, stop time and race past the guards blocking the servants' stairwell, disable a wall of light in the main hall by pickpocketing a guard, or even enter from an outside balcony that you can reach via the gardens. Essentially, the second floor gives us a little dose of Dishonored action, as we need to avoid detection, break into the three Boyles' rooms, and then rifle through their possessions, which will eventually turn up a love letter from Hiram Burrows, which reveals the correct daughter. In a neat little twist, this is always randomised, so you can't look it up online beforehand, which is a clever way of forcing players to engage with the design that I really appreciate. The advent of online guides has rather ruined developers' desires to spend time crafting proper puzzles, and I really respect Arkane for making sure that theirs aren't skipped. So, now that we know the correct Boyle, the focus switches to eliminating her, but of course she's wandering around a crowded party, so we need to get creative. Alongside the love letter, we can read her diary, and depending on the sister, we can learn something about their personality and then use this against them. Waverly Boyle is deeply paranoid, and when speaking to her, we can warn of a threat against her life, encouraging her down to the safety of the basement and away from prying eyes. If it's Esma, we find that she has a voracious sexual appetite, and after a bit of flirting, she'll invite us up to her room, and into a moment of deadly privacy. The final sister is Lydia, who is passionately devoted to music and who you can lie to about your own musical talent, encouraging her into the secluded piano room where she's easy to remove from the party. Even with the guests bluntly advising you to sneak upstairs, this is a very satisfying sequence of gameplay that reinforces the dialogue-driven, non-combat atmosphere, but it's unfortunately spoiled by a rather intrusive alternative route. You see, while looking around the party when you first arrive, you'll quickly be approached by Lord Brisby, who recognises Corvo and begs him to stay his hand, as he is madly in love with the daughter that he correctly assumes we are here to kill. He offers an alternative. If we can knock her out and bring her down to the basement, he'll take her away into his care, where he assures us that she will never be heard from again. Another example of how horrifying the non-lethal options usually are. While he doesn't know the colour she is wearing, he offers up her name. And this is a big issue considering how absurdly easy it is to then work out who is the correct Boyle. Not only can you use the heart, which reveals the daughters' names, and the concern which is plaguing them, but there is another NPC at the party who will tell you their names and colours in exchange for bringing over a drink. This solves the entire mystery in a matter of minutes, and is a real disappointment, considering there is so much more that could have been done with the party setting. We could have had multiple guests to question, red herrings thrown in by disgruntled rivals, more clues that needed to be found, or hell, even just having Brisby refuse to give up our target's name would have made the sequence much more engaging. Now, before you jump down my throat, this criticism is actually based in something the developers themselves have stated, as in an interview years after Dishonored's release, Harvey Smith talked about how the original version of the party had far less player guidance. The guests didn't talk about going upstairs, and the non-lethal alternative didn't point you immediately in the right direction. But apparently playtesters would become confused about what to do and where they could go, which led to Arkane adding in some pretty obvious signposts. Call me an elitist, but I think it's a real shame, as while Lady Boyle's last party is beautifully constructed from a visual, structural and pacing perspective, the core gameplay conceit is just far too easy to resolve. And I think it robs the sequence of that wonderful aha moment that should be its climax. Arkane still deserve a lot of credit for being brave enough to even try and construct a level like this, especially when they could have just stuck to what was already working. But I've always felt like Corvo is at his best when he's putting his blade in the backs of those in power, rather than rubbing shoulders with them. Now, we've done a lot of talking about gameplay and level design so far, which is not entirely surprising considering it was Dishonored's excellence in these areas that finally put Arkane on the map. Thing is, I want to change gears and talk about something else that Dishonored does very well, an element of video game creation that often goes rather unappreciated: world building. If you're not familiar with the term, it originated in discussions about fantasy and science fiction writing, and refers to the process whereby authors develop their setting, which in these genres is particularly important as that's a big part of what makes them so popular. It's come to encompass everything from J.R.R. Tolkien developing a functional Elvish language, to George R.R. Martin putting together huge tomes of Targaryen royal history, and even includes things like Brandon Sanderson setting out the rules behind his many complex magic systems. Essentially, if your story is set anywhere other than planet Earth, world building needs to be part of the equation. And even if you've got the most engaging characters and a supremely original narrative, if readers can't understand the setting, you might as well have nothing. Now, when it comes to books, this is all very well understood, but for some reason it's not something that often wins much acclaim in the world of video games, where critics and players tend to hyperfixate on function over imagination. Sure, there are games like Bioshock and Cyberpunk that really sell themselves on the idea of exploring their worlds, but it's not often you hear a recommendation that places this above gameplay or graphics. An especially strange situation considering how popular non-real world settings have always been. So, considering that Dishonored was both a new intellectual property that needed to introduce its unique setting and was also aiming to be a highly immersive experience, world building was just as important as its art design or the construction of its levels. And so I want to take a closer look at what exactly Arkane have crafted. We'll start with Dunwall, as it's through understanding the capital of the Empire that the game opens up far beyond the simple revenge story that we experience through Corvo's eyes. Something that we've already touched upon is how well Dishonored presents the conflict between the haves and the have-nots, but this dynamic is really much broader than a straightforward class divide. Dunwall is a society separated into those who have power and those who don't, and this power can take on many forms beyond just wealth, ranging from military might to scientific brilliance to the magical influence of the outsider. It's this dividing line that is largely the reason for there being so much misery on the streets, as in the face of the unstoppable plague, the people of Dunwall are scrambling for whatever security they can find. The City Watch constantly abuse their positions of authority, violent gangs form lawless enclaves where strength is the only rule. The rich wall themselves away in their opulent mansions, partying as the kingdom burns, and the poor take on back-breaking and often dehumanizing work in order to maintain access to safety. Dunwall may be a city in a state of near collapse, but it is not collapsed just yet. And that's what makes it so interesting to explore, as there's this faint veneer of civilization, straining under the weight of sickness and decay. Now, something that has become almost expected of this sort of immersive game is for the developers to include small snippets of written lore, interactive books on the shelves, or readable letters hidden away in a noble's desk, all of which have been placed to give the impression of a much wider world. Often this can be a lightning rod for criticism, as you can easily argue that the hundreds of books in Skyrim don't actually add any depth if nobody ever reads them. And I think this is something that Arkane have been conscious of while designing their own little snippets of readable world building. For starters, nothing you find is ever particularly long, maybe at most a few paragraphs, but typically just a handful of lines, and they almost always relate to the environment you find them in, which both enriches the immersive experience but also provides information that's actually useful. Take the short document called The Ancient Music, which can be found in either the Overseer's compound or in the substation on your way to kidnap Sokolov. It outlines the work of an Overseer philosopher who discovered a natural rhythm that underpins the world of the Empire, akin to the Fibonacci sequence but in audible form. Through the study of this phenomenon, he was able to develop a 17-note scale that could close the world off from its connection to the void, and this was then weaponized into music boxes that the Overseers use while battling heretics. It's a cool snippet of lore that shows the degree of fear surrounding the influence of the outsider, but it also has interesting gameplay repercussions, as later in the game we come face to face with Overseers armed with music boxes, and have to operate in situations where we might have our powers closed off to us. This is also true of the life cycle of the plague, something which is not at all explored in the game's story, and is instead fleshed out through optional documents. Through reading the diaries of various rat catchers and the studies of Dr. Galvani, we can learn that the plague rats are larger, faster and smarter than your average city rodent, and will swarm over unsuspecting victims if they stray into their territory, something we see firsthand as we escape from Coldridge Prison. It's an awful way to go, but what's equally horrifying is the fate of those who become sick, as they develop a searing fever, begin to weep blood from their eyes, and descend into a state of madness that always results in death. The non-infected have taken to calling them weepers, and again it has a knock-on effect in the gameplay, as the deeper we head into Dunwall, the more weepers we begin to encounter, and working out how to deal with their unpredictable and violent movements presents a totally different challenge to the strict patrols of the City Watch. Now, all that being said, you don't have to engage with the world building in order to understand either of these gameplay concepts, but I do think part of what makes Dishonored so distinct is how committed Arkane are to this style of writing. For example, despite us spending the entire game within Dunwall's city limits, there are constantly references to the wider world of the Empire, a sprawling dominance that covers 4 large islands known as Tivia, Morley, Sarkonos, and Gristle. We frequently see talk of nobles attempting to move abroad in order to escape the plague, or baseless accusations that the other nations have planted the sickness. But it's the Isle's monstrous, unconquered 5th island, Pandyssia, that casts the longest shadow. Pandyssia is a vast and unexplored space, covered in wild jungles and strange abandoned temples, a hostile and dangerous land where virtually every attempt at colonization has ended in tragedy. Despite all the technological progress in Dunwall, Pandyssia remains an elusive mystery. In fact, this juxtaposition of the supposedly civilized world of the Empire and the wild unknown of the wider world is central to 2 of Dishonored's biggest fantasy ideas. The first is the whaling industry, a brutal economy that is clearly meant to parallel our own destruction of the natural world, but does so with a heavy dose of Lovecraftian horror. Essentially, the Empire is built upon the energy generated by burning whale oil, which is harvested by crews who head out to sea and capture the beasts on large trawlers, and in the early parts of the game we can see one such ship hauling its catch back to shore. Now, the impact of this industry is everywhere in Dunwall, as almost every technological device, from the tallboys to the walls of light to the alarm systems used by the guards, are all powered by tanks of whale oil. And even beyond this, whale meat is constantly found in kitchens and is considered to be a common foodstuff. On the surface, this doesn't seem all that disturbing, especially when people are starving in the face of a lethal pandemic, but the more we read about the industry, the more twisted it becomes. We can discover that the whales are kept alive as oil is drained from their organs and the meat sliced from their bodies, a practice that causes enormous pain for the animal, but is done because the whalers believe it delivers a higher yield. It's justified by the slaughterhouses and shipyards portraying the whales as dangerous monsters that put the trade routes of the Empire at risk and whose bones are used by followers of the outsider. But there are dissenting voices who call this into question. In Dr. Galvani's offices, we can find a treatise called The Leviathan's Sorrow, written by a natural philosopher called Pacotti, who unsuccessfully attempted to convince the College of Natural Science that the whales formed complex social bonds, and by tearing them from their natural environment, the Empire was causing untold ecological damage. As with anyone who tries to do good in Dunwall, his protests fall on deaf ears, and the whaling economy rolls on. But it leaves us with a pretty awful picture of the cost of progress in the Empire. This is a world built on the plunder of the natural world, where the wealth of the few and ever-increasing military strength are placed far above the needs of its citizens. And if we're completely honest, it doesn't exactly sound like the rule of Empress Jessamine Caldwin was that much more pleasant than that of the Lord Regent. The perfect example of this is how religion works in the world of Dishonored, as this is another way that the technological modern world is juxtaposed against the wilds of nature. The state religion of the Empire is the Abbey of the Everyman, a strange philosophy whose practices are managed by the Office of the High Overseer, and which is far more functional than you might typically expect from a fantasy setting. Rather than espousing belief in an otherworldly deity, the Abbey is based around the rejection of magic and is entirely secular in its focus. Its central tenets, the 7 strictures, are both commandments for how to avoid the influence of the outsider, but also a rulebook for subservient and productive citizens, a clever way of maintaining both a spiritual and political status quo. For example, its first tenet is to restrict the wandering gaze, a reminder that the illusions of the outsider can corrupt your perception of what is important, but also a subtle warning that looking beyond your station or assigned lot in life will supposedly bring disaster. Similarly, the 4th tenet, restrict the roving feet that love to trespass, claims that you can only survive against the howling winds of the void when you stand upon a solid foundation, but also makes it clear that visiting foreign lands or entering the homes of the honest is akin to walking on broken glass. It is a doctrine of strict social laws, and while the Overseer's primary responsibility is to hunt down heretics and burn witches at the stake, the sheer pressure of the Abbey's rules mean that the Empire has long been able to maintain control of its people, without always needing a blade to their throat. Now obviously the Outsider's patronage of Corvo and the Overseer's support of the Lord Regent puts us in direct conflict with the Abbey, but it's interesting how the rules have been written to stand in contradiction of Dishonored's gameplay. The wandering gaze, roving feet, errant mind and restless hands are a rather poetic way of describing what we do in each level. And I think it's another clever way that Arkane uses world building, not just to add flavour, but to reinforce the central ideas of the game. We aren't just playing as a man with supernatural powers, but someone standing in opposition to the very way society is organised. And this makes Corvo's actions carry so much more weight, something you'll only understand if you engage with the writing. Now to end this little section, I want to take a look at the Outsider, because while this mysterious and feared being holds a position of real importance in both the narrative and world building, it's the one area where Arkane hold back and don't actually provide many clear explanations. In an interview with Kotaku before the game's release, Harvey Smith claimed that it was possible to lose yourself in world design, and while every other element of Dishonored has been wonderfully fleshed out, there is a masterful restraint on show when it comes to the Outsider. We know he visits people and bestows upon them various terrible gifts, but beyond this, we don't really get too many clues as to what he's trying to achieve or why he interferes with the world of man. This gives him an almost cosmic horror feeling, and by opting against a complex and detailed backstory, the Void and its master come across as something unknowable, a terrifying force of nature, rather than someone who can be reasoned with. This is very much on show when we encounter the other people who have been touched by his power, as Corvo Attano isn't the only person in Dunwall to receive gifts from the Void, and often their motivations run in direct conflict with ours. The first we meet is Granny Rags, an elderly lady living in the distillery district. While she initially seems like a frail old woman being hounded by the Bottle Street gang, we could discover that she is actually far more malevolent. During our mission to Holger Square, if you choose to defend her from a gang of thugs, she'll send you on a side quest to poison the Bottle Street gang's bootlegging operation, which you might be tempted to do in exchange for a couple of runes. The thing is, later on we discover that Slackjaw and his gang aren't actually all that bad, and the elixir they're producing is saving the lives of citizens in the local area, something which immediately ends if we work for Granny Rags. In fact, later on, we can come across Granny Rags in the process of sacrificing Slackjaw to the Outsider, and if we attempt to stop her, she'll call upon a horde of vicious rats to tear us limb from limb, all with previous alliances forgotten in the blink of an eye. Interestingly, it appears her gifts are also totally different to those Corvo receives, as she can't be killed until we burn an effigy that she keeps hidden away in her den, which seems to imply that the Outsider's touch can take on a great many different forms. Now the other major disciple of the Outsider that we come across is Dowd, the man responsible for the death of the Empress, and someone who plays a pretty major role in the wider franchise. We'll explore his character a little more in a latter part of the video, but he's essentially a hitman for hire, and leads a group of assassins who dress as whalers and operate out of the flooded district, a part of Dunwall that collapsed into the sea and is now overrun with weepers. Dowd is unique amongst those touched by the Void in that while his powers are very similar to Corvo's, they're able to be passed on to those around him, and at various points in the game we see his whalers teleporting across rooftops, which is how they were able to penetrate the defences of Dunwall Tower. What's curious about this is that the conflict between Dowd and Corvo makes it abundantly clear that the Outsider doesn't see his disciples as some sort of team, and instead simply watches what they do when given godlike powers. In this sense, you can potentially understand the Abbey's extreme fear, and the brutal fashion in which they try to guard against his influence, because even the few examples of his power that we see during the game have the potential to wreak untold havoc on the Empire and its people. This all adds a wonderful sense of moral greyness to the world of Dishonored, and elevates it far beyond a basic revenge story, where those you find yourself in accord with aren't doing things for altruistic reasons, and those who you are targeting might not be all that evil. Will those labouring away in the slaughterhouses or brothels be any better off under the rule of young Emily Caldwin? Does a man deserve to die because he aligns himself with a church that keeps him safe from the very real danger of magic? Can regime change alone save a kingdom from a near unstoppable tide of sickness? These are the questions that haunt your every action when playing as Corvo Attano, but you'll only know they exist if you take the time to engage with the writing and let Arkane draw you into this chaotic and twisted setting. In the world of fiction, imaginative world building is often enough to sell a novel on its own, and I think it's high time that we started treating this complicated part of video game creation with the same level of respect. Gameplay and graphics and sound design and storytelling are all vital parts of an engrossing game. But sometimes all you want is to be transported to another world, and this is something that very few games do quite as convincingly as Dishonored. So let's return to the Hound Pit's pub. As with Lady Boyle either dead or in permanent captivity, all that remains is to strike at the head of the snake, Hiram Burrows, the traitorous royal spymaster and Lord Regent. With the Overseer's office in disarray, Dunwall's parliament in deadlock, Sokolov missing and the loss of his aristocratic support, the Regent has taken what few loyal men remain and barricaded himself in Dunwall Tower. Havelock and Martin tell Corvo that this is the final step in their quest to restore the Empire, and as you set out with Sam the boatman, it feels like we're coming full circle, returning to the location of Jessamine Caldwin's murder, vengeance finally within our grasp. Interestingly, before we step onto the boat, we're able to have a little interaction with Emily, as her tutor Callista can be found at the bar, complaining that the young heir hides away as a way of taunting her. If we can find Emily scurried away near the clock tower, she'll agree to return to her studies and reward Corvo with a rune that she supposedly found while digging on the beach. It's a small moment, but an important one, not only because it reinforces that parallel with the beginning of the game, where we played hide and seek with Emily in the grounds of the tower, but because it gives a final reminder that Corvo is the only man that the young girl about to take the throne truly respects. Now, while we're headed back to a place we know all too well, things are very different to our last visit. That shining morning has been replaced with a gloomy sky, and as Sam leaves us to our business, it becomes clear that the tower itself has been warped to reflect the chaos tearing apart Dunwall. The vast waterlock has been deactivated to prevent unwelcome guests, and this means we have to manually climb into the tower's entranceway, where the paintings and playing children have been replaced by tall boys, arc pylons, and a plethora of elite city guards. Now, the design of the tower itself is closely related to the structure of the Overseer's compound and the Golden Cat, a large multi-leveled space which needs to be infiltrated and then mapped out before we can locate our target, but it does have its own unique gimmick. You see, Hiram Burrows' behaviour will completely change depending on if he suspects an attack from the masked assassin that has been killing his allies. If you manage to get into the tower without raising the alarm, he'll be meeting with General Tobias and attempting to regain control of the city, before retiring to his heavily guarded bedroom on the building's top floor. If you're a little louder and Burrows knows you're coming, he'll retreat to a new structure grafted onto the top of the tower, and this makes the level quite a bit longer, as you need to make your way through the interior, then work out how to strike at the paranoia-stricken region inside of his sealed bunker. Now, what's cool about this setup is that there are lots of ways to accidentally alert Burrows, and you can even end up sending him to the bunker without tripping the alarm. For example, if you enter his bedroom and take any of his possessions, he'll realise something is amiss and flee to his panic room, which will also happen if you take out General Tobias and he never turns up for their meeting. In fact, you can even alert Burrows on purpose by interrupting a sort of steampunk Skype call happening in the tower's main foyer, where you can choose to remove your mask and reveal that the assassin who destroyed his reign was none other than Corvo Attano. Obviously, this leads to an enormous brawl as guards charge to the Lord Regent's defence, but it's a flashy way to bring Corvo's hunt for revenge to a close, especially if you've been going loud and proud. That being said, there's also a little treat for players that want to stick to the shadows, as if you snuck upstairs in the Boyle mansion, you should have been able to steal the Dunwall Tower skeleton key, a gift Burrows offered so that his lover could come and go as she pleases. This allows you to bypass a complex set of keys and locks that separate the various sections of the tower interior, and it feels like a huge reward for really paying attention in previous levels. Much like finding the invitation to Boyle's party in Bunting's safe, I love that Dishonored has these moments of continuity between the missions, as it really helps create the sense of a cohesive adventure, something that linear level-based games can often struggle to achieve. Now, of course, the tower has its own non-lethal solution, and just like at the Golden Cat, it involves never spilling a drop of blood. While that might sound distinctly unsatisfying, this alternative instead delivers some major revelations about what triggered the events that led to Jessamine's death. If instead of heading to the bedroom or safe house, you make your way up the eastern wing of the tower and past an arc pylon guarding a stairwell, you can break into the Lord Regent's propaganda office, where you come face to face with a familiar voice. You see, during your adventures, you'll often see large speakers hanging above the streets of the city, which inform the citizenry about the current state of affairs and usually report on whoever Corvo's last victim was. Given the office's proximity to the Lord Regent's living quarters and his previous life as the Empire's spy master, control through information is clearly an integral part of his plans, and it's through this that we are able to bring him down. As it turns out, the propaganda officer is happy to bargain in exchange for his life, and he assures us that Burroughs keeps an audio diary, and within these recordings are state secrets that could topple the administration. Thankfully, he also has the code to Burroughs' safe, and if we sneak into his bedroom, we can get hold of these recordings, an indisputable proof that the spymaster hired Dowd the assassin to kill Jessamine Caldwin. Now, considering Dowd is an outlaw and a known associate of the outsider, this information isn't enough, but also on the recordings is evidence of an even greater crime. As the audio card feeds into the machine, Burroughs' voice begins to boom out across the city, and he reveals that the plague, which has taken thousands of lives and brought the Empire to its knees, was brought to Dunwall shores on his command. The twisted motivation was to eliminate poverty with plague rats from the Pandician continent, who would infect the city's drunks, beggars and homeless and leave behind a productive and obedient population. Obviously, the situation quickly spiralled out of control, and before Burroughs knew what was happening, the plague was taking the lives of poor and rich alike, and its severity had prompted an investigation ordered by the late Empress. Knowing that his terrible mistake was about to be exposed, Burroughs launched a coup, and armed with his powerful connections, he orchestrated the death of Jessamine Caldwin and became the Lord Regent. With this revelation echoing around Dunwall, his time on the throne comes to a screeching halt, and as we leave the propaganda office, we can see Hiram Burroughs being arrested by his own guards, who can barely contain their disgust that they have been working for the man who caused all this chaos. It's a beautifully fitting way to bring down the architect of Corvo's lengthy nightmare, and while there is a personal satisfaction in revealing yourself in the depths of the safe house before striking that final blow, giving the people of Dunwall the truth feels far more empowering. So with Burroughs finally deposed, we head back to Sam and the enraptured cheers of our loyalist friends, who celebrate the inhuman achievements of the Royal Protector, the man who managed to save the Empire in a single week. We share a drink with Havelock and Martin and then head up to our room for a well-deserved rest. But as we step across the threshold, something is clearly wrong. Corvo has once again been betrayed, and he comes around for just long enough to overhear why. Standing above him, Havelock, Martin and Pendleton interrogate Sam, seeking reassurance that he put enough poison in Corvo's drink, and then they encourage one another that they have done the right thing. With Corvo at Emily's side, the precocious new Empress would have never listened to their advice, and would it really be fair for the men that brought down the Lord Regent to have no say in the future of the Empire? They are the men with the big ideas after all, so why shouldn't they dictate the direction of this new era? So as Corvo fades away, we are left with the gut punch that all of our actions have achieved nothing. Emily is once again the hostage of a military coup, and Dunwall has simply passed from one dictator to the next. Now this is a twist that many people claim they can see coming a mile away, and maybe that's a fair criticism, as the Loyalists really do very little to make us believe that they truly have Dunwall's best intentions at heart. If you'll remember, when we read their souls with the outsider's heart, it hardly gives glowing character references, and there are even a few moments where they place Corvo in totally unnecessary danger, tricking him into tasks that have nothing to do with the battle against the Lord Regent. During Lady Boyle's party, Pendleton asks us to deliver a letter to a supposed friend of his, but when we do, it appears he has actually sent us to fight a duel on his behalf. A situation that could have easily led to Corvo's death had he not been blessed with extraordinary powers. Similarly, early on in the game, Havelock will have us head down into the sewers to clear out a few lingering Weepers, but considering the area is locked down and the Weepers pose absolutely no threat, it's simply placing Corvo in harm's way for absolutely no benefit. Considering that power in Dunwall seems to utterly corrupt almost everyone that it touches, maybe this betrayal was always destined to happen, but that doesn't have to mean that it's poor storytelling. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite, as by giving us another set of villains, we're thrown into a finale that reflects back how you chose to deal with the Lord Regent, and shifts in tone based on the choices that you've made. This is a world where you can never escape the consequences of your actions, and in Dishonored, our last few hours as Corvo Attano provide a reckoning not only to the loyalists who couldn't stay the course, but to you, the player, for the blood that you've spilled. When Corvo opens his eyes, he's lying in a boat, floating through the flooded district. You see, Sam couldn't bring himself to administer the full dose of poison, and instead only gave the Royal Protector half, deceiving Havelock and sending his unconscious body out into the only part of the city that the Loyalists wouldn't dare follow. While this act saves Corvo's life, it unfortunately leaves him in a pretty tricky situation, as while in a weakened state, he's picked up by Dowd's whalers and imprisoned while they attempt to strike a deal for his sale. This brings us to the penultimate level of Dishonored, the Flooded District, another linear sequence that follows a similar structure to the kidnapping of Anton Sokolov, but does so with a few unique twists. Firstly, we begin the level without any of our gear, which means no knife, no crossbow, no mines, no sleep darts, and no elixirs, and instead we have to rely entirely on our powers, carefully managing our mana and scraping together what resources we can find. As Dowd's whalers are far more capable than the clueless City Watch, travelling in pairs, taking up positions on rooftops and teleporting around the environment, it can be a challenging prospect without your full kit. But I do like the change of pace this provides after the all-out complexity of Dunwall Tower. Disempowerment is often something that video games don't exactly nail, especially when you're forced to play without elements that you've spent hours investing in. But it works in Dishonored because you still keep the critical parts of Corvo's arsenal. Now, what I really like about this level is the atmosphere, as the flooded district feels like the true face of post-apocalyptic Dunwall, a crossroads of municipal decay and physical disease that is very different to the rest of the game. Everything has this sickly sepia tinge to it, and as we clamber around half-collapsed buildings and dive in and out of foul hagfish-infested water, it feels a far cry from the glamour of Lady Boyle's mansion, or even the small comforts of the Hound Pit's pub. It almost feels like a glimpse into the future of the city, the inevitable destination if the plague is left unchecked and those in power tear themselves apart over the carcass. So after a bit of hunting around, you'll find that your equipment was dumped in the Greaves refinery, an abandoned oil processing plant that has become the home to weepers and river crusts, a kind of mutated mollusk that defends its territory with poisonous spit. Now at the bottom of the refinery, we have to creep around a large group of weepers, and in a clever little touch, among them is the fallen High Overseer Thaddeus Campbell, who must have succumbed to the plague after being expelled from the Abbey. It's moments like this that make Dishonored such a rich experience, but this is only the start of how detailed and unique your version of the Flooded District can get. You see, there is an entire gameplay system we have yet to talk about, Dishonored's Chaos rating, which silently judges your version of Corvo and then transforms the final sections of the game depending on how you dealt with your targets, how many people you killed en route, and how brutal you were during the side quests. If the rating gets high enough, you'll pass from low chaos into high chaos, and depending on which state you're in, lots of different things can happen within the Flooded District and the game's finale on King Sparrow Island. The most obvious consequence is that the more people Corvo kills, the more bodies exist for the rats to feed on, and in high chaos the Flooded District is absolutely overrun with weepers. In an attempt to counter this, both the Whalers and City Guard appear in much greater numbers, and it creates this feedback loop where the consequences of killing necessitate even more bloodshed. By contrast, low chaos creates a much less threatening world, and in this version, weepers are few and far between, and there will be far less guards, as those in charge don't see the need to ramp up their forces. Now, as you can see your chaos rating at the end of each level, this is something that most players will have in mind as they progress through the game, and it encourages you to purposefully pursue one outcome over the other. Considering that so much of the game is designed around invisible player reactivity, this might be a disappointingly artificial way to direct players towards each game state, but I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. The chaos system is supposed to be a reflection of you, the player, rather than something you actively chase after, and this is perfectly exemplified by Corvo's confrontation with Jessamine's killer. When we finally reach the Whalers' headquarters, situated in the ruins of the financial district, and come face to face with Dowd, his response to Corvo will always follow the same general outline, but will feel totally different depending on your morality. You see, it turns out that slaying the Empress and throwing Dunwall into disarray hasn't sat all that well with the supernatural assassin, and in his office we can overhear Dowd ruminating on his life, wondering if there was any purpose behind all the death he's caused. In low chaos, we are able to confront this self-reflection head-on, stepping out of the shadows and into a duel, where Dowd orders his men to stand off and allow Corvo his chance at revenge. When we overpower him, we can then choose mercy, and this astounding moment of empathy convinces Dowd that there is far more power in restraint. It's actually a very moving moment, but that only works if your version of Corvo has turned away from base revenge, choosing to spare the lives of those that stand in his way, and only dealing out repercussions to those who killed Jessamine in the pursuit of power. Now, if you're carving a path of mayhem through Dunwall, the encounter with Dowd plays out very differently, despite having the same constituent parts. When we stand forwards and confront him, now rather than accepting your judgment, the assassin calls for reinforcements, and the fight turns from a climactic duel into a mass brawl, one which Corvo of course wins. Here, when Dowd reveals his guilt, it falls on deaf ears. In this high chaos version of the story, the only thing that matters is action, and to commit a crime like the slaughter of an innocent Empress, one who was trying her best to save the sick people of the Empire, well, that is a sin that must be answered. Again, it is thematic and fitting no matter the state of chaos you find yourself in, and it's a real tribute to the writers at Arkane that they were able to come up with a narrative that functions so well in two totally variable interpretations. Now, beyond the changing tone of these big story moments and influencing the amount of warfare on the streets, the chaos system also changes lots of smaller things. For example, if Corvo is particularly merciless, it will subtly shift Emily's personality, and rather than drawing bright pictures and being kind to her attendants, she'll develop a cruel streak and paint dark pictures of her protector's mask. By contrast, our mercy doesn't go unnoticed in low chaos, and here Emily will become increasingly committed to saving not only the city, but the people within it, recognising the value in staying your blade. Another variable moment takes place during quite a lengthy section in the Dunwall sewers, where Corvo desperately tries to make his way back to the Hound Pit's pub after his confrontation with Dowd. In low chaos, we find that those forced out of their homes by the plague have formed a society of survivors deep underground. The implication is that Dunwall might actually be able to rebuild after this catastrophe, as there is a will to work together that exists among the underclass. When we arrive back at the pub, we again see this spirit in action. Sokolov and Piero have abandoned their rivalry and constructed a machine that will incapacitate Havelock's soldiers, protecting the other loyalists and saving the life of Callista, who is then able to signal Sam to return to shore and ferry Corvo towards the betrayers. It's a sequence dripping with optimism that we might actually be able to put everything right. But if you put bloody vengeance at the centre of Corvo's story, this all plays out in a much more nightmarish fashion. Rather than finding the people of Dunwall banding together, here the depths of the sewers are filled with weepers, and when we arrive back at the pub, we find the corpses of the remaining loyalists strewn out on the lawn, murdered by Havelock's men in an attempt to cover up their crimes. On this path, we have to take the key to the clock tower from poor Callista's dead hands, and when Sam comes to the shore to pick us up, he treats us with scorn and openly tells us that he has no idea why he is helping. Just like in our confrontation with Dowd, the plot beats are virtually identical, but the impact is totally different. By this point, the two variations feel like completely separate games, leading to two divergent conclusions. And that is exactly what Arkane delivers in Dishonored's final mission, the infiltration of King Sparrow Island, a heavily defended naval base where the traitorous loyalists have taken Emily, and the stage upon which we play out the conclusion that we have earned. Structurally, King Sparrow Island is a lot like Dunwall Tower, beginning with a large open area that gives us multiple ways to sneak inside the fortress before switching to a more complex interior space, where we have to locate our targets and make our way up to the top level of the lighthouse. It's as pure as Dishonored level design gets, offering lots of overlapping pathways to our goal, and plenty of opportunity to use our void abilities and remaining equipment, which by this point should be as close to full power as possible. It gives King Sparrow Island an almost victory lap atmosphere, as by this point Corvo has overcome every man and woman, witch and warrior who could have possibly stood in his way, and to be frank, the paltry forces of Havelock and Martin don't pose all that much threat. So the question becomes, how does Arkane keep the level interesting when you are so much more powerful than your foes? Well, the answer lies entirely in payoff. You see, regardless of if you arrive at King Sparrow Island in high or low chaos, the fates of the Loyalists are already set, and rather than meticulously planning their demise, the level is a process of discovering how each of the three men met their grisly end. In high chaos, we arrive at the lighthouse against a background of a storm, with seas churning and rain hammering down, an obvious portent of the darkness to come. Here Sam finally snaps and berates you for your cruelty, even going as far as to fire a gun and alert the soldiers if you've been particularly violent. And this throws us into a twisted version of King Sparrow Island where madness has taken over. Once inside, we find that the Loyalists have fallen upon one another, and in the courtyard we see Martin and his soldiers besieging the gatehouse, where Pendleton is returning fire and baiting Corvo to take out the Overseer. Considering their betrayal of the new Empress and the man who made everything possible, this turn of events should come as no surprise, and when we confront Martin, he admits that the temptation of power has ruined their good intentions. Rather than offering himself up or fighting back, this guilt consumes Teague Martin, and in penance for his actions, he puts a gun to his head and steps out of our story for good. Up in the gatehouse we find Trevor Pendleton, but this is no confessional. While he is mortally wounded from his battle with the Overseers, he remains bitterly defiant, hurling insults at Corvo and claiming everyone in the court knew that he was having an affair with the Empress. We can choose to cut this slander short or leave him to succumb to his injuries, but either way, the glamorous and influential Lord Pendleton dies without dignity, slumped against the wall in the stairwell of a military base. All that remains is Havelock and Emily at the very pinnacle of the lighthouse, and here we're given a few different methods of approach. One last flourish of player choice before the credits roll. You see, while we were away in the flooded district, Admiral Farley Havelock, a man usually so composed and assured of his action, finally snapped. With his allies turning on him, Dunwall breaking beyond repair, and his honour lost forever, his sanity abandons him, and he takes the young Emily hostage, hoping to barter for his life with the threat of a long drop into the sea. Impressively, there is a huge amount of ways to deal with this situation. We can use possession to force the Admiral to let Emily go, freeze time in order to rescue her without him even knowing, climb up around the back of the elevator machinery and ambush him, or even just take our chances with a well-placed crossbow bolt. Whatever you choose, Emily ends up safe in Corvo's arms. But the cruel Empress we have inadvertently created and the ruined empire we leave for her are a hollow inheritance indeed. But this does not have to be the ending, and in another version of these events, Dunwall and Emily Caldwin rise to the example set by their legendary royal protector. Here King Sparrow Island is bathed in sunlight and surrounded by calm waters, not a place of madness but of order, where the cruel get what they deserve and good triumphs over evil. Sam lets us off the boat with an encouraging word, impressed that you have always stayed your blade when easier options were available. And as we pass through the courtyard, up through the gatehouse and into the tower, we meet little resistance and see no sign of the Loyalists. In the dining room of the lighthouse's office, we find that once again Havelock has broken down under the weight of his actions, and sitting at the table are Teague Martin and Trevor Pendleton, who have both been poisoned after a bout of paranoia. The difference is that here, Havelock knows he cannot win, and as we wait in the shadows, we can hear him confess his sins. He had always believed in strength and will above all else, but he's been destroyed by a man who does not kill, a situation he cannot fathom, and one that proves that he is not capable of being the Lord Regent of the Empire of the Isles. When we confront him, he talks of Emily's love for Corvo and freely hands over the key to her room, submitting himself to either life in Coldridge Prison or death, whichever we feel he deserves. When Emily emerges from her room, the two embrace, and we're shown the consequences of our actions. The plague is cured by the combined efforts of Sokolov and Piero. Empress Emily Caldwin rules as a just and true leader, and Dunwall is pulled back from the brink of ruin. Now, there is a temptation to read these as good and bad endings, but as I've already said, I don't think Arkane are providing goals for us to aim at. Instead, these endings are supposed to reflect how you treated the world of Dishonored, and give you an ending that thematically suits how you played. It's interesting to note that you can actually kill around 20% of the game's enemies and still get the low chaos ending, which means it's perfectly possible to play a version of Corvo who kills the Lord Regent's conspirators but spares the low-level guards, or avoids killing sickly Weepers but punishes Dowd and the Whalers. It's really not as binary as this script is probably making it seem, and rather than looking at it as a choice between good and bad, instead it is just an ending, one informed by the Corvo that you have created. Now, that doesn't mean it's perfect, and frankly, having things like the quality of the weather, or the fate of Sam the boatman, or the solution to the plague all tied to your kill count doesn't exactly make much sense, but I almost feel like it's not meant to, as we don't actually see the conclusion with our own eyes. Instead, having it narrated to us by the outsider, it almost feels like it's supposed to be taken as mythology rather than fact. Like this is some long-lost history where dates have become lost and details blurry. We assume that Sokolov and Piero cured the plague because Dunwall carried on, and storytellers embellish their version of Corvo Attano with sunlight and storms. In fact, this ambiguity hides one final mystery that never receives a clear answer, no matter how much or how little chaos you cause. The question of Emily's father. You see, here in the lighthouse, we can read Havelock's diary, and in the first entry, he wonders if the rumours at court are really true. Is Emily Caldwin Corvo's daughter, and is his loyalty to the Empress born out of love? Well, the young heir certainly does care for the royal protector, and will even sometimes draw pictures of him that say Daddy underneath. But is this just a little lost girl looking for a parental figure, or something more? Similarly, if we cast our mind back to the very opening of the game, that letter from Jessamine to Corvo, she told him that her heart is at peace when he is near, and if you're particularly observant, you might have noticed that the ethereal voice that speaks from the mechanical heart is the same one that died in our arms. It is a tantalising, unanswered mystery. While we might be able to warp reality, turn back the tides of the plague, and single-handedly save the Empire, there is nothing we can do to change the past and bring back the ones we have lost. Ultimately, I think it's a deeply compelling ending to a deeply compelling game. An experience that is somehow both weaving a complex and highly directed story while also managing to put player choice at the centre of everything it does. So many games that have you take on an active role in the story do so through really blunt and obvious moments, coming across more like a digital choose-your-own-adventure novel. But in Dishonored, Arkane have proven that there is another, far more elegant way. While the game is rightly held in acclaim for its creative level design, its inventive gameplay, and its unique art direction, it's this commitment to a believable and immersive world that I love most of all. And the fact that no two playthroughs are exactly alike, despite this being a strictly linear experience, is something genuinely incredible. It might have taken Rafael Colantonio a decade of commercial failure, and required Harvey Smith to go from soaring highs to crushing lows, but in Dishonored, our two outsiders proved that they had always belonged in the video game industry. The future might have looked bright for the Empire of the Isles, but it was even brighter for Arkane Studios. So given everything we've discussed, it should be no surprise that Dishonored was a big hit. Despite being new IP in an unfashionable genre from a virtually unknown studio, it landed extremely well with both critics and players. Across PC, PS3 and Xbox 360, it ended up with an average review score of 9 out of 10, which included very positive coverage from influential outlets like 1UP, GameSpot, IGN, Game Trailers and The Escapist. At the end of 2012, it appeared on almost every single Game of the Year shortlist. The recognition from organisations like DICE, GDC, Spike and BAFTA helped foster the impression that Arkane had made something very special. Now what made this all the more impressive was that Dishonored wasn't just a critical darling, and actually managed to sell quite a few copies, likely because of that ambitious marketing campaign that Bethesda threw behind it. Despite stiff competition around its launch from big releases like Call of Duty Black Ops 2, Mass Effect 3, Far Cry 3 and Borderlands 2, it managed to sell 500,000 copies in its first month, and as its reputation grew, that number massively increased. By Thanksgiving weekend, it had climbed to be the #1 seller on Steam, and according to Bethesda's publishing reports, By 2015, it had moved 3 million copies on PC, and a further 1 to 2 on home console. Considering Arkane's spotty commercial history, this was an incredible result, and proved Todd Vaughn's faith in the studio had been well placed. In fact, ZeniMax marketing director Pete Hines even gave an interview to Destructoid where he openly discussed how pleased they were with Arkane. Apparently Bethesda saw Dishonored as a major new franchise, and while that set fans ablaze with excitement for a sequel, Arkane weren't quite finished with Dunwall and the Plague. You see, the 7th generation marked a huge rebirth of developer and publisher interest in add-on content, and by the 2010s, this sales tactic had been honed to razor sharpness. Almost every major single-player game launched with the promise of further content, and thanks to some extremely high-quality releases like Oblivion's Shivering Isles, Dark Souls' Artorias of the Abyss, and Grand Theft Auto 4's Ballad of Gay Tony, just to name a few. This practice of squeezing more value out of a high-profile release was actually viewed quite positively. This meant that rather than immediately moving on to the next game, Arkane shifted gears and began developing a spread of DLC. And just as they'd done when they began Dishonored, they didn't pull any punches with its ambition. Now that being said, this wasn't immediately clear, as the first post-launch release was the Dunwall City Trials, a series of challenge maps that were released in December of 2012. Each one is based around a unique map and focuses on specific parts of the Dishonored formula, like Train Runner, which asks you to beat a train to a station by using your blink to get around obstacles, or Mysterious Foe, which has you collecting clues in order to identify an NPC which needs to be eliminated. There are 10 different challenges in total, each with an expert version that adds even more variables, so if you find yourself consumed by Dishonored's stealth and sneaking, the City Trials provide a pretty meaty additional serving. Now the problem I have with it is that Dishonored was always about more than just its gameplay, and divorced from the rich world building that drives everything forwards, it feels like a shadow of the experience found in the main game. It's perfectly playable and often surprisingly fun, but I feel like it was put together to sell additional content, rather than because the team at Arkane passionately wanted to work on high score driven gameplay. Now thankfully, the Dunwall City Trials were a mere side note compared to what would come next. 2 extremely large pieces of story-driven DLC. It didn't feel like bonus content for hardcore fans, but a critical piece of the franchise. If there was any concern that Dishonored might have been an accidental miracle, the Knife of Dunwall and the Brigmore Witches proved that it was anything but, and masterfully introduced us to a whole new side of this world. Now surprisingly, rather than picking up where the main game left off, the Knife of Dunwall, which was the first of the pair released in April of 2013, takes place at the same time as Corvo's quest for revenge, but concerns itself with events happening elsewhere in Dunwall. Here we take on the role of Dowd, seeing the murder of Jessamine Caldwin from his perspective, and then exploring the aftermath of his change of heart. A curious premise, considering his motivations aren't particularly fleshed out in the base game. We see that in the aftermath of the Empress's death, Dowd was visited by the Outsider, a reunion years after he first received its blessing, and began selling his dark skills to the highest bidder. The mysterious deity has one last gift for our master assassin, a clue to his role in the fate of Dunwall, a name, Delilah. Dowd is tormented by this. Is Delilah an enemy or an ally? Is she even a person? And what does she have to do with the guilt he feels as he watches the city crumble around him? This mystery is the central driving force of Dishonored's DLC, as Dowd's journey is not one of revenge, but of redemption. Now, before we even spend a second talking about Knife of Dunwall's gameplay or level design or narrative, we need to address the biggest change, which is that Dowd is rather more talkative than the notably silent Corvo. While we still control his responses to the events of the game, Dowd is not strictly an avatar for the player, and has a much more clearly defined personality. He provides narration before and after levels, has small conversations with his lieutenants, and will even talk to himself if he sees something worthy of comment. Just like in the base game, this is provided by the legendary actor Michael Madsen, whose gruff tone and weary delivery really sells Dowd as a grizzled veteran who's slowly losing his taste for the chaos of paid violence. It really feels like his actions at Dunwall Tower weigh heavily on his heart, and it's helped by some excellent writing that paints him as a sort of poet assassin, someone who won't hesitate to take a life, but also understands the toll that this takes. Seeing the way he interacts with the world, pursues his motivations, and interprets the events of Dishonored 1 is genuinely one of the most interesting elements of the game, and this new talkative approach to storytelling is a great evolution for the series. Now, along with a shift in the delivery of the narrative, we also have quite a few changes to the gameplay, as while Daud shares many of the same abilities that the Outsider bestows upon Corvo, he has his own distinct flavour of action, stealth, violence. The most distinct part is that just like we saw in the base game, Daud can pass his abilities onto his followers, and this is represented by a new skill called Summon Assassin. This calls in a whaler to fight alongside you, and by upgrading another new skill, Arcane Bond, you can give them increasingly powerful abilities that make them pretty deadly in combat. Conceptually, it's a great idea, and along with our second in command, Billy Lurk, providing intel at the start of each mission, and the ability to buy favours from your crew, which provides things like special keys or extra runes, Daud feels like he has a shadowy organisation at his beck and call, a real contrast with Corvo, who was always completely alone. Now, the only problem with this is that in practice, Summon Assassin is only useful when you're doing a high chaos playthrough, as for some reason they can't take out enemies while in stealth. It's a frustrating oversight that means you don't get to use Daud's most thematic power if you're going for a no detection run, but thankfully this is balanced out by other good ideas. The best is the changes to Daud's Blink, which now also triggers a stop time while you're aiming the skill, and this transforms an already satisfying move into a god tier ability. As Daud also freezes in place, you can do things like chaining multiple blink assassinations together to clear out entire rooms in mere seconds, or leaping from a window and then using your blink to pause in the air before zipping off in another direction without ever touching the ground. When used in combination with an improved agility skill, which has had its jump height increased, Daud feels dramatically more nimble than Corvo, and it gives the gameplay this wonderful sense of speed, where you're conducting lightning strikes on your own terms, rather than patiently waiting for an opening. Now, while this might sound like the balance of power has been tipped towards the player, these new tools are evened out by a few other gameplay changes that mean you have to make some tough choices about what to invest your runes in. When you begin the Knife of Dunwall, you have the base level Blink and the base level of a new skill called Void Gaze. This is effectively a combination of the Heart, which shows you where runes and bone charms are located, and Corvo's Dark Vision, which highlights enemies through walls and reveals their line of sight. In Dishonored, this skill is absolutely critical to any stealth playthrough, as it's your way of examining the surroundings, but in Knife of Dunwall, you need to spend extra runes before you unlock the stealth-related elements of the skill. This obviously takes away skill points that would otherwise be spent unlocking powerful abilities, and it delays how quickly Daud reaches the level of power that you might be used to in the base version of Dishonored. It's a small change to player progression, but it has quite a big impact. And in tandem with much more complex levels that have a lot more enemies in them, Arkane were clearly trying to up the difficulty, despite the spread of powerful new tools. So while playing as Daud is great, another big appeal lies in seeing more of Dunwall, and each of the 3 locations we visit more than live up to the high standards of Dishonored 1, while also bringing a bit of unique flair. Visually, it's a much more picturesque and colourful experience than we saw as the Royal Protector. Gone are the sepia-tinged ruins and gunmetal facilities, and in their place, docks bathed in beautiful sunsets, factories that look more like medieval castles, and sprawling noble homes full of detailed architecture. The fact that it's such a joy to look around really lends itself to the investigative objectives, and if you're happy to soak in the atmosphere, there is lots more clever world building, which once again enhances the gameplay and story in equal measure. Our journey begins in Dunwall's Slaughterhouse Row, a shipping wharf where whales are brought in for harvest and coin piles high in exchange. Daud's second in command, Billy Lurk, has discovered that the owner of the Rothwild slaughterhouse, Bundry Rothwild, owns a ship called the Delilah, and so armed with nothing more than a hunch, Daud sets out to discover the meaning behind the name. At the gates of the factory, we hear that Bundry's men are on strike after having been whipped into a frenzy by a union worker called Abigail Ames. And while the oil continues to flow, it's now being produced by a gang of vicious scabs that are more than happy to get violent in exchange for work. As if we needed any more evidence that Dunwall is built on a pretty rotten foundation, it's here on full display. We see the state military getting involved in an industrial dispute, hired thugs murdering a unionist, a factory boss who tortures their employees, and even one of the poor captive whales moaning in pain as the butchers extract their blood-soaked prize. Thankfully, we can put the beast out of his misery with an overloaded electric shock, but there is no such cure for the issues that face the slaughterhouse. Out on the edge of the wharf, we can discover that Abigail Ames is actually working for a rival company, and is only stoking the fires of unionism so that her paymasters can snap up cheap labour and make a grab for Rothwild's contracts. This is a city where the good-hearted hold almost no influence, and that really comes to the fore as Dowd progresses in his hunt for Delilah. As ever, it's supremely reactive to how you want to play, but where things get really impressive is that Arkane have tried to move away from the binary lethal and non-lethal solutions, which dominated Corvo's revenge story. Inside the slaughterhouse, we find Bundry Rothwild interrogating Abigail Ames in the top floor office. But as either one of these NPCs can tell us what we need to know about the Delilah, it's totally up to you how you want to deal with the situation. We can listen to the pleas of the unionist agitator, which involves taking out Bundry and then blowing up the slaughterhouse. A solid option that removes a terrible man from a position of power, but one which hands over his workers to an even crueler master. Alternatively, Dowd can choose to stay out of the industrial conflict and simply strap either one into an interrogation chair, extorting what he needs at the point of a knife, a choice which doesn't hurt any of the workers but is obviously pretty psychopathic. Either way, it feels a lot more organic than the solutions in the base game, and it allows you to interpret what Dowd would do in a way that still gives the player lots of options. Well, regardless of what you choose, you discover that the Delilah was originally owned by Barrister Arnold Timsh, an influential noble who has been made the head of the Lord Regent's judiciary. Apparently he named the boat after a woman he had become infatuated with, a servant girl from Dunwall Tower, who he invited into his home after discovering she had an extraordinary talent for art. So armed with that clue, Dowd heads to Dunwall's legal district, and the second location of the game, Barrister Timsh's large 4-storey mansion, where he hopes to discover more about this artist who has enraptured the nobles. As it turns out, there are quite a few people willing to help, as Timsh's rise to power under the Lord Regent has led to him making quite a few enemies. The first we meet is his niece Thalia, a young socialite and associate of Lady Boyle, who has got in contact with the Whalers through Billy Lurk, and who agrees to tell them everything she knows in exchange for a copy of her uncle's will, which she suspects has been changed. This sets up a hunt through the mansion, where we have to locate the will and avoid an enormous amount of guards, as Barrister Timsh is hosting a visit from General Turnbull, a high-ranking member of the Empire's military. Of course, there is another completely different method available, and this one delivers a familiar ironic fate to our art-loving lawman. You see, the Lord Regent placed Barrister Timsh in charge of the Death Counters, an organisation designed to collect bodies from plague-stricken households, and which is being abused to frame wealthy families and steal their property in the name of the state. One such wronged noble is Roland, a merchant who will aid us in our hunt for Delilah if we carry out his plans for revenge. In order to do this, we need to steal Timsh's letter of criminal immunity, make it seem like he's come down with the plague, which should mean he's arrested by General Turnbull when he arrives at the mansion. So now, rather than looking for the will, we're trying to pickpocket the owner and plant a rotting corpse in the air ducts, all before a huge amount of steel turns up in the lobby. It's a great level in its own right, with a really fun stealth premise, but what's cool is that, again, neither of these options strictly follow the typical lethal or non-lethal structure. There's nothing actually stopping you from sneaking into the house and just killing Timsh, or wiping out the general's men so he never arrives, and there's even an entirely different strategy that involves hiding on an adjacent roof and sniping the barrister when he comes out onto his balcony. The genius isn't found in the individual options, but that all of them are available to you, and you could frankly replay this level hundreds of times over before getting exactly the same sequence of events. Clearly, Arkane had mastered this kind of open-ended sandbox-style level design, and for 2/3 of its runtime, The Knife of Dunwall is the absolute peak of the Dishonored formula. It's captivating, it's immersive, and it's reactive to your choices. Everything you could possibly want from an extra piece of content. This is why the final third of the game is so disappointing, because for some reason, Arkane abandoned this structure. Regardless of how you deal with Timsh, Dowd eventually discovers that Delilah is far more than just a servant girl with a talent for painting, as both Thalia and Roland claim that she has supernatural powers which are allowing her to manipulate the city's nobles. In fact, in the barrister's mansion, we can see this for ourselves, as we eavesdrop on Timsh deep in conversation with one of Delilah's sculptures, and if we head into the room ourselves, the statue will magically spring into life and warn Dowd that he will only find death if he refuses to abandon his investigation. Clearly Delilah has something sinister planned, but what it is and where she will strike remains a mystery. So Dowd heads back to his headquarters in the flooded district, but discovers that a different catastrophe has befallen him, as the Whalers' base has been discovered by the Overseers and now lies in ruin. This throws us into the final level of the game, where Dowd has to repel the attack and free what remains of his men. But rather disappointingly, this whole section is surprisingly unambitious. The Whalers' headquarters uses the exact same map as it did when we were here as Corvo, with the only real difference being that the ground floor hasn't yet flooded. But considering that the area was originally designed around you never walking there, it doesn't feel like this has a particularly big impact on how you get around. Similarly, the process of freeing the Whalers and killing the Overseer leader just isn't that interesting. And as there's no distinct alternative solution or any variables triggered by your chaos rating, it can come across more like a challenge map from the Dunwall City Trials. Now this might seem strange, but actually it isn't the only part of the DLC that was remixed out of existing assets, as the second level in the legal district had originally started life as part of the base game, and had even been shown off to journalists in 2011. It had eventually been cut, but came back to life during the development of the DLC. A funny situation that means it's only really the slaughterhouse that was built from the ground up for the Knife of Dunwall. Now you might think that I'm pointing this out as a criticism, but really it's a testament to Arkane that they were able to recycle assets so convincingly. And you could even argue that seeing Dowd defending his home is thematically satisfying, as we know that in just a few weeks' time, this will all happen again under the blade of Corvo Attano. So while our chaos rating doesn't shift the gameplay, it does deliver two distinct endings, with the bridge to the next DLC changing based on how you view Dowd's change of heart. If you've gone with high chaos, it will be revealed that it was Billy Lurk who betrayed the Whalers' lair, offering Dowd up to Delilah in exchange for leadership of the group, as she felt their leader had gone soft with all his post-Empress murder guilt. In this version of the ending, Delilah appears and commands that Lurk execute Dowd, but out of respect for everything that he'd done for her, she instead offers a duel and a chance at winning back the Whalers' respect. When you inevitably win, you can choose to either spare or kill Lurk, with each option giving a slightly different epilogue narrated by the outsider, either describing her leaving Dunwall in shame or reliving her and Dowd's first meeting in the moments before her death, where we learn that he took her in from the streets and saved her from a life of poverty. In low chaos, this choice is still there, but without the duel, as Lurk realises the error of her ways and submits to Dowd's leadership, putting her life in his hands and asking for forgiveness, which we can choose to give or withhold. Now honestly, I don't really like this ending, as I think the reactions from Lurk are the wrong way round. You'd imagine that if Dowd was tearing through Dunwall and murdering all in his path, Lurk wouldn't dare risk challenging his leadership. And it makes little sense that him suddenly sparing the worst people in society is what prompts her to abandon her coup. It's just a little wonky, and it means that the chaos system doesn't have quite the same impact that it does in the base game, where it creates two very different but very appropriate conclusions to Corvo's story. Now unfortunately this isn't the only place where the DLC's narrative gets a little uneven, but in order to get to that, players would have to wait for the next instalment, as the Knife of Dunwall only takes us to the halfway point in Dowd's tale. Despite its incomplete nature, it was still very well received by both players and critics, who almost universally praised the new gameplay ideas, the changes to the storytelling style, and Arkane's already iconic approach to level design. With the Knife of Dunwall, Dishonored had become a proper franchise, one where a war between assassins and witches could be just as enticing as the Royal Protector's quest for vengeance. It would take 3 months for the next instalment of DLC to arrive, but when The Brigmore Witches released on August 13th, 2013, Almost a year after the base game, the wait was very much worth it. Not only does this serve as a satisfying conclusion to Dowd's storyline, but it introduces a lot of new ideas and gives us a glimpse into where the series would go next. We begin with a short recap from our master assassin protagonist, where Dowd meditates on what has happened in Dunwall since the Overseers attacked his headquarters. Plague grinds the city down, corruption rots, a mad killer stalks the streets, and Dowd wonders if this is all punishment for his crimes. Except that he knows the world doesn't punish the wicked. It bears repeating that he's just a very compelling character, and this odd mixture of poetic self-reflection and a supernaturally infused skill for murder makes him a great foil to the wordless vengeance of Corvo Attano. In fact, this parallel is a big part of the Brigmore Witches, and we begin in a premonition, where Dowd attempts to fight off the attack from Corvo that he knows is eventually coming. When he awakens, we find ourselves in what remains of the Whalers' headquarters, where a spy by the name of Thomas reports that he has located Delilah and her coven of witches. She's holed up in the old Brigmore mansion on the outskirts of Dunwall, but getting there isn't exactly straightforward, as it's on the other side of a quarantine zone, and can only be accessed safely by travelling down the Wrenhaven River. Despite their name, the Whalers don't have a boat, so Dowd suggests they call in a favour from a local gang called the Dead Eels. The only problem is that their leader, Lizzie Stride, is currently locked up in Coldridge Prison. So the plan is clear. Break Stride out in exchange for a trip down the river, and then strike at the heart of Brigmore Manor in order to stop whatever twisted plan Delilah has for Dunwall. Now what's cool is that before you head off for Coldridge, you can actually wander around the headquarters and overhear some of the Whalers speaking about the events of the previous DLC, and quietly signalling that Billy Lurk wasn't alone in doubting Dowd's leadership. Anyway, the first level takes us back to Coldridge Prison, the very first location we experienced as Corvo Attano, although this time we're trying to break in rather than break out. Now I do have to admit that when I first played through this area, I was extremely underwhelmed, and felt like it somehow repeated all of the issues that I had with the return to the flooded district, rather than introducing us to areas of the prison that we'd missed while escaping. Something you'd expect considering the building looks absolutely monstrous from the outside. The level layout is virtually identical. We have an entranceway with an adjoining security office, a courtyard with an overlooking control tower, and the only new areas are a small block of identical cells and a courtyard outside. Compared to the detailed architecture of the Rothwild Slaughterhouse or Barrister Timpshire's mansion, it's a real step down in complexity. And even though Arkane have tried to remix the environment slightly, it's just not all that interesting to explore. When we arrive, we quickly learn that thanks to Corvo's escape, the Lord Regent has dramatically increased security, which means a lot more guards, the installation of arc pylons, and a speaker system that pumps Overseer music around the facility, which prevents void abilities from being used. Now at first this all sounds very interesting, like the premise of the level might be a less complex layout, but forcing us to approach it without our most reliable tools. But once you get inside the building, the walls block out the music and everything reverts to normal. The objective then shifts to locating Lizzie Stride, and here you have two options. Either search the cells manually or rescue the officer that freed Corvo, who is about to be executed in the yard and will offer up her cell number in thanks. With that we can then plug it into the central system and then carry the unconscious Lizzie to freedom. A remarkably straightforward and challenge-free level by Arkane standards that doesn't really kick off the DLC with a bang. This bothered me for quite a while, but when replaying the game I noticed there was an entirely different way to approach this level that I totally missed. You see, before the mission begins you can purchase favours from your assassins, and one of them is an Overseer uniform that Dowd can use to sneak in through the front door. Now while I'd initially thought this was just another method of breaking into the facility, it actually completely changes your approach to the level, as Dowd can stay in character once he's inside, and this means you don't have to spend all your time blinking around the ceiling. It gives you a bit more freedom to examine the environment, and this leads to some quite interesting details, like an interrogation room at the back of the prison that's full of overgrown roots and has the body of a charred witch strapped into a chair. Through a nearby audiograph, we can learn that the Overseers have begun to suspect Delilah is planning something big, but their attempts to extort information keep ending in failure, as she is somehow able to destroy her followers and those around them by warping the natural world. It's a chilling insight into her power, that she can affect things from great distances and wield magic in a way that neither Corvo or Dowd or even Granny Rags was able to. So anyway, with Lizzie Stride free, we have a captain who can take us upriver, but unfortunately there is another roadblock to overcome. You see, Stride was only in prison because she had been betrayed by her second in command, Edgar Wakefield, and she'll only agree to transport Dowd if he helps her take back leadership of the Dead Eels. So for a second time in this journey, Dowd sets out to eliminate an upstart rebel, and this takes us into the heart of Dunwall's Draper's Ward. Now, if Coldridge Prison was slightly underwhelming in its ambition, the Draper's Ward more than makes up for it, as this is by far the most complex area that Arkane had designed up until this point, and it takes up about 60% of the entire DLC. The idea is that this was a fashionable district in Dunwall, a place once occupied by expensive shops and socialite spenders, but in the face of the plague and the Lord Regent's loosening grasp on power, it's now been overrun by two warring gangs. One is the Dead Eels, who operate out of a riverfront port from their ship the Undine, and the other is the Mad Hatters, who are led by the Geezer and are currently on top thanks to a lucrative deal to produce plague shawls out of their mill. This section of the game takes us all over the Draper's Ward, into 4 separate areas which are each of a similar size to Coldridge Prison, and are stuffed full of optional content like side quests, hidden upgrades, and even a shop that you can use mid-mission. With a huge amount of verticality provided by the 4-storey buildings and the eels and hatters fighting in the streets below, it's a real return to the chaos that Dishonored does so well, and we're free to either get stuck into this turf war or use it as a distraction while we pursue our own goals. Now, here is probably a good place to talk about the new gameplay elements introduced in the Brigmore Witches, as while it is largely identical to the Knife of Dunwall, Arkane have brought a few new ideas to the table. We now have an additional ability, Pull, which allows us to grab inanimate objects from a distance and is very useful when trying to pickpocket guards or disconnect machinery. Once it's been upgraded, Dowd gains the ability to do this on organic matter, and suddenly it becomes a ridiculously powerful tool, as you can grab guards from distance and then choke them out, which is a nice addition as most of the upgrades tend to revolve around murder. The same is true of the new gadget, Baffle Dust, which functions a bit like a stun grenade and can be used to confuse alerted guards and prevent them from raising the alarm, something which previously required you to take their life. They're both solid additions to Dowd's arsenal, but the star of the show is the new Corrupted Bone Charms, a third kind of collectible that brings powerful bonuses alongside some serious drawbacks. For example, Shivering Silhouette makes enemies far more likely to miss their shots, which makes Dowd practically invincible to anything other than close-range combat. But the drawback is that you are far more easy to spot, which makes stealth virtually useless and forces you into an action-heavy playstyle. There are 9 charms in total hidden across the DLC's 3 missions, and each one does add an interesting twist to the gameplay, with my personal favourite being statuesque. This removes your magic regeneration, which means you go through blue elixirs very quickly, but the trade-off is that when Dowd stands perfectly still, you are completely invisible. If you pair this with the upgraded Blink, which remember, freezes time while you're casting it, you can move huge distances without ever being seen, and stand in the middle of a group of enemies without them ever knowing you were there. It's a strange feeling considering that so much of Dishonored involves desperately avoiding open spaces, but I love that this bone charm flips that on its head, and it gives the final few hours of gameplay in Dunwall a distinctly unique flavour. So the aim in this area is to eliminate Edgar Wakefield, who we can find cowering in the hull of the Undine. Once he's out of the picture, Lizzie reassumes control of the gang, but Edgar has done more damage than she realised, as his terrible leadership has allowed the Hatters to steal the ship's engine coil, which of course means that Dowd needs to go and retrieve it. So we head back through the Draper's Ward and into the mill, where we get another dose of classic open-ended Dishonored level design. With just a little poking around, we can find out that the Hatter's leader, the Geezer, is rather unwell, and is passing on his orders through his assistant, Nurse Trimble, a man who many people suspect is secretly running the show. Once inside, you'll find that the coil is locked up down in the basement, and only Trimble knows the code, so your first instinct would be to go and confront him. Inside the top floor office, we find him tending to a very sick Geezer, and he tells us that they only took the coil because their water wheel broke down, and for some reason, everyone that goes into the sewers to fix it never returns. Trimble makes us a simple offer. Get the wheel turning, and we can take the coil. which means a trip down into the sewers to work out what exactly is happening. Now the clever thing about this section is that it begins very similarly to Corvo's own journey through the sewer, and there's a real tense atmosphere where you're constantly expecting to run into a pack of weepers. This means that when you come across a woman crying out for help, you may well rush over to her aid. This is where Delilah strikes, springing an ambush where we get our first taste of combat with her coven. Now, as it turns out, the water wheel was disabled by the witches, and if we cut down a pair of unnaturally strong roots, we can refill the canal and return Trimble to reclaim our prize. It's a satisfying little loop of action gameplay, but as we should come to expect, there are a great many other solutions. Down in the sewers, we can come across the dead body of the last man sent on this quest, Pete the mechanic, and if we take the key to his apartment, we can find that he had his own record of the mill door codes, meaning we can take back the coil without lifting a finger to help the hatters. On top of this, there's an entirely different third solution, one which brings back some of the moral greyness that we saw in the Rothwild slaughterhouse. You see, on the top floor of the mill is Nurse Trimble's laboratory, where the hatters presume he is brewing the geezer's medicine. If we get up there and take a closer look, we can discover that he is actually brewing an antidote for a nerve toxin, one which is being administered to the geezer in order to keep him unwell and secure Trimble's position in the gang. If you set off one of his lab timers, you can then sneak into the office and speak to the geezer without Trimble present, and here the old man makes us a different kind of offer. He knows the engine room code, and he'll hand it over in exchange for Dowd putting him out of his misery. The thing is, he doesn't just want any death, he wants us to remove the oil tank from his respirator, which will trigger a failsafe flooding the mill with the toxin and destroying the hatters for good. It's a pretty wildly selfish last request, considering there are normal people working down in the mill, but if you want to avoid the witches in the sewers, this is the only way to go. Obviously releasing the toxins will also kill Dowd, so we need to brew a copy of Trimble's antidote, which requires a little scavenger hunt across the ward in order to find everything we need. Once that's done, you pull the plug, get your code, and watch everyone die. Brutal method, but one that a less penitent, high chaos Dowd might well choose. After all, he is the man who killed the Empress. So with the engine coil in our hands, we head back to the Undine and set off down the Wrenhaven River to confront Delilah once and for all. Now, while this is the climax of our time with Dowd, the Brigmore Manor is quite a strange place for the DLC to end, as rather than capping things off with a hyper-complex level full of reactive moving parts, it's actually quite a straightforward experience. We arrive just outside of the manor grounds and are met by Thomas the Scout, who informs us that he can't see an obvious route inside, which means we have to follow the expected pattern of working out how to infiltrate the building before hunting down our target. Here we have two options, both of which take us around the exterior of the manor and into its backyard, where we can find a lever that opens a path through the Brigmore crypt, or a path across the eastern roof which drops us down at the front door. Once inside, our sole objective is to work out what Delilah is planning, and compared to the grey moral decision making and the sprawling alternative paths that make up the rest of the DLC, it's all rather uncomplicated. But that doesn't mean it isn't interesting, and actually Brigmore Manor introduces a lot of new ideas that give Delilah's hideout a uniquely supernatural identity. Aesthetically, there's a real contrast with the metallic and brick colours of Dunwall, and instead of whirring machinery and cramped streets, we find ourselves in a wide open space, dominated by gnarled tree roots and a mist rolling in off the river. There's a sort of natural mysticism to the level, and this is also reflected in the enemies and obstacles that we have to overcome. Along with the witches of Delilah's coven, we have to avoid the gaze of living statues that will wail in terror if they spot Dowd, and work out how to deal with a pack of gravehounds, an all-new enemy unique to this level. Much like the statues, they're a sort of void being conjured forth by Delilah, and they provide a pretty interesting gameplay conundrum, as they can't be killed unless you smash their skulls in close quarters. This means they can't be taken out from a distance, and if you've been playing the DLC as a shadowy sniper, disintegrating enemy bodies from range, this will really throw a wrench in your plans. So inside, we can track down her studio on the very top floor, and here we find that through her paintings, she is able to access disturbing powers. Deep within a nexus of void energy, she plans to conduct a dark ritual and swap minds with Emily Caldwin, trapping the young heir in the void while she assumes the throne. You see, part of the mythos that Delilah used to endear herself to the nobles was that she is Jessamine Caldwell's illegitimate sister, but was banished from court long ago by the late Emperor Yuhon. Of course, we only have Delilah's word that this is the truth, so there's no way we can know if her claim to royal blood is anything more than an elaborate mask. Either way, Dowd resolves to stop this crime, largely motivated by guilt for his own sins against the Caldwell family. And at the very peak of the manor, we can step into a magical painting and confront Delilah. Now this presents us with what is essentially a Dishonored boss fight, and it's very cleverly designed so that just like everything else in the game, there are multiple ways to stop the ritual. You can just fly directly into combat, which causes Delilah to summon the assistance of multiple living statues and transforms the otherworldly space into a vicious supernatural fight for the future of the Empire. If that's not your speed, you can always shoot her with a sleeping dart or choke her out, which allows you to swap the painting of Emily for one of the Outsider's domain, and then finish the ritual yourself, trapping the witch outside of time and space for all eternity. In a nice little twist, you can even have Delilah destroy herself, as if you manage to swap the paintings without her noticing, she'll press on with the ritual and unknowingly condemn herself to the void. And it's extremely impressive that Arkane were able to twist their ideas into boss fight form, especially as so many other games in this genre seem to really struggle with climactic one-on-one duels. For Arkane to have cracked this code in a piece of add-on content shows just how committed they were to the project, and frankly, as we watch Dowd return to the Whaler headquarters and await his judgment at the hands of Corvo Attano, it's incredible to think that this wasn't a full-price release. There are so many creative ideas, so many interesting locations to explore, and so many twists on the established formula that calling it DLC doesn't really do it justice. This is a sequel in all but name, and likely one of the best value pieces of post-launch content that's ever been produced. Considering the glowing reviews and Dowd's status as a fan favourite character, this might well be an opinion you've heard before, so let's end this journey with something a little different. My great issue with the story of Dowd and Delilah. You might remember that when we were talking about Knife of Dunwall, I spoke about how I didn't really think the chaos system suited the narrative that Arkane were trying to construct, as it clashed with the portrayal of Dowd as a man seeking penance. Well, while the gameplay and level design and art in the Brigmore Witches are all absolutely brilliant, I think this narrative issue still remains. And after the revelations about Delilah's plan, if anything, I think it's worse. You see, we never really get a proper explanation for Dowd's change of heart, only that he sees the effect the Empress's murder has had on Dunwall, and then suddenly decides to abandon his life as a contract killer and head off in a supernatural battle against evil. For me, I think this could have all been fixed by setting the DLC after Dishonored 1, and presuming that Corvo sparing Dowd's life is the correct in-world choice. This would give him a reason to rethink his actions, and would then suit both the violent and merciful versions of his hunt for Delilah. Either he's a man trying to atone for the past by repeating this kindness, and grasping at redemption by protecting the little girl whose life he once ruined, or he's a born killer, trapped in a cycle of violence that has no idea how to do good without drawing blood. It might sound sacrilegious, but as it stands, I don't think his motivations make a lot of sense. And that key question of why the Empress's death bothered Dowd so deeply is never really confronted head on. It's a shame, as there is real potential here for a captivating story about how otherworldly power can change someone's very soul, paralleling Delilah's grab for the throne with Dowd's desire to be better. But as it stands, it's more of a mildly interesting mystery, told through some truly excellent immersive sim gameplay. So, with the release of the Brigmore Witches, the era of Dishonored 1 finally came to an end. The future was pulling Dunwall and the Empire into an obvious next step, the first proper sequel in Arkane's history, Dishonored 2. A tale of another outsider, another would-be ruler, another city, and for another time. We began this video talking about people who had the bravery to do things differently. Those creators who weren't satisfied to work like everybody else, and in the process wrote their names into history. I truly believe that the work of Rafael Colantonio, Harvey Smith, and and the team at Arkane deserves to be held in this same level of acclaim. Not only because of the incredible game they produced, but because they did it after a decade of adversity. To have come through the commercial disappointments, the cancelled games, the small fry support contracts, and then announce yourself with one of the most creative games of the 2010s is frankly an astounding story, and I don't think people quite understand the force of will that this must have taken. Now, some people might say that Dishonored is just Thief with magical abilities, or a steampunk version of Deus Ex, or Bioshock with gory assassinations, but the fact that it can only be defined by comparing it to some of the greatest games ever made, well, that is a testament to quite what Arkane had managed to achieve. It's a stealth game, but it's also an action game. It's a sandbox for player freedom, but it's also a tightly written drama. It's sprawling world building told without a single cutscene. A game where you legitimately care if you kill a nameless guard, despite also making it outrageously fun to do so. It doesn't matter if you're guiding Corvo on his blood-soaked tale of vengeance, or seeing Dowd make amends for the sins of the past. Dishonored is a beautiful, chaotic puzzle of a video game, one begging to be unpicked, that still feels as fresh as the day of its release, well over a decade later. Now, the only question is what would come next for the ambitious international studio and the dark world that they'd crafted. What do you do when you're no longer on the outside? Well, that is a story we'll explore very soon. So given it's the end of the video, we better do a bit of housekeeping and thank yous. If you missed my stream a few months ago, I'm now out of cancer treatment and being monitored, which is an enormous weight off my shoulders. I want to say again that I'm so thankful for all the support you've given me while I've been going through this, as it really has made a massive difference. Now, that being said, my awkward year means there are going to be a few changes on the channel. You'll be seeing videos much more often, and if you subscribe to my Patreon, you'll be getting a high quality video per release on YouTube. The first, The Licensed Games That Should Not Be, is out at the moment, and I've got another chunky one lined up for when we leave Dunwall behind. If you do decide to back the channel there, please know that I appreciate it so much, as it's what allows me to keep doing this, especially after a year where my work rate was beaten back so badly. So once again, thanks for watching, thanks for supporting, and I'll see you very soon for a little jaunt down the streets of Karnaca.